Welcome back. If you are rolling into, no, if you have just flicked on this episode and this is the first thing you've listened to on H Hour with Paul Tyson, then I suggest you go back to the episode before this, which is the icebreaker with Paul. It's about 20 minutes long, answering questions. Paul is answering questions submitted by H Hour patrons. Very, very good questions, and it serves as a very good lead in and a run in to this full podcast. If you don't want to do that, you can completely ignore me and continue listening now at your leisure. If you want to submit questions for the guests in future or have access to the live link, so at the time of this recording right now, there are people watching this on a live link, patrons, then you should become a H Hour patron. The links to those options are in the blurb of this episode. And it costs as little as £3.50 a month. Absolutely nothing. That is actually cheaper than a coffee these days, unless it's a Greggs coffee. Greggs is £2.60. Everywhere else is like £4 or £5 for a coffee. Greggs, I highly recommend. And if your local Greggs sells corned beef pasties, then I suggest a corned beef pasty as well. That was a digression and a half. On to the podcast. Paul Tyson, welcome to Hey Shower. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And so first interview ever.
Yeah. Well, the first interview
shocked.
on this side of the mic.
Yeah. So you've been 30 years nearly in media, news, and this is your first interview. I find it hard to believe.
No, it's not my job. My job's to be on the other side of the mic.
Maybe it is now. Maybe it is. Maybe it's a career change coming up. Okay. Can you give me give listeners a quick outline of your career in media in general, credentials, shall we say, and also your military side?
Yeah, so so chronologically, I joined the army straight from school, more or less, in 1987. Served through to the end of '93 with an infantry unit, Princess of Wales's. Well, actually, I joined the Queen's Regiment and then amalgamated as the Cold War came to an end. Became the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment. Had an absolutely fantastic time. Loved every minute of it. And it sort of gave me an enormous amount of sort of background, useful, relevant background for what I went on to do, which was, firstly, I did a sort of a, I don't know what you call it, a diploma, I suppose, a college course to do journalism when I left, and then got a job with a news agency and newspapers, then sort of freelanced on newspapers, various different sort of Fleet Street newspapers, then went into regional television news and then on to national television news, where I've worked for 24 years, I think, something like that. A long time. So, I've been in the media of one sort or another for an awful lot longer than I was ever in the army.
Yeah. It sounds like an amazing experience, though, to be honest. I mean, a lot of people who've been outside the military, never been in it, think, oh, did you 20 or 30 years in the military, must have been amazing. And I'm listening to you talk about 20 to 30 years in media, reporting, journalism. You're an editor now, right? And that to me sounds like an amazing vocation as well, especially as you covered a lot of different wars as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, the good thing, sort of little pitch for anyone in the forces or leaving the forces who's vaguely interested in the media, don't be put off. It's a challenging job. It's hard to get into. Pay's not great. In fact, the pay stinks, generally speaking. No one gets rich from it, but it's just such a rewarding career that if you can ride the pain, if you can get in, then I speak personally, it's an incredibly rewarding career. It's got variety. It's got, you meet some incredibly inspiring, interesting people, entertaining people. You work with incredibly dedicated, focused, high-performing people all the time. And you find yourself in incredible situations. You cover amazing stories, and in my case, I've been lucky enough to sort of go around the world doing various things, everything from sort of climate change to war zones to earthquakes and whatever. And there's never been a job I've not enjoyed. I've never done a job I've not enjoyed. Sometimes in the office, you can feel like one day slightly like the last one, but not often. Enormous amount of variety, and I would say that there's a few sort of ex-military in journalism broadly, but not enough. I think there should be more. There's a guy you may have interviewed him, Johnny Ball, who sort of advocates for getting
Yeah, Johnny. Yeah,
more
yeah,
people
yeah,
into politics.
yeah.
And I think that journalism maybe needs that kind of that for the same reasons. It would be beneficial I think for everyone. And we talked about diversity, right? It would be interesting if there were more veterans sort of in the media, and not least because it's an incredibly rewarding job. And there are skill set crossovers. There are things that I did in the army that bled into what I do in journalism that made it easier for me to do certain things. So there are ex-military guys. There's a lot of ex-signals guys used to be in satellite engineering. There's less of that now as sort of technology changes. But there's some very good, for some reason, always ex-Royal Marines. But camera operators. There's a guy at Sky. There's a guy at the BBC. There's a Fleet Street photographer I know who are all ex-Royal Marines. So there are veterans that I'm not by any means unique, but certainly we need more. And if it's something you've considered, I can only speak personally, but I've had an amazing career and I've absolutely loved it, and I would recommend it to anyone.
I recently had Nigel Ely on as well, who's another great example, like yourself, of going from the military into journalism, and it does definitely seem to tick some boxes in ex-military people's what should we call it, catalogue of satisfactory needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
On their media definitely ticks some of those boxes for some people, I think, for sure. But yeah, so do you think so I hammer on legacy media quite a lot. I'm regularly disappointed, rightly along by what I see or read in legacy media now. But also there are amazing people like yourself, amazing people in legacy media doing amazing work. So I'm not completely unaware of that, and I certainly don't think that every legacy media platform provider, producer is out there to deceive people or toe a political line. But it seems to me that it cannot be easy from a morale perspective, motivation perspective, to be in legacy media now in whatever capacity. Certainly if you're a journalist or a presenter. Is that the case? Oh, you've done 30 years, right? So nearly 30 years. How is you perceiving the changes over the last 10, 15 years? Public perceptions of the media changes. How does that influence people working in the industry?
I not as much as I think you might imagine. I think broadly, I think sort of there is a kind of thing if you go online, and particularly certain platforms and certain kind of groups of online people where you'll sort of see relentless kind of criticism. I mean, quite often nonsense criticism. I mean, there are some valid criticisms also, but a lot of it's demonstrably nonsense of the mainstream media, and there's a lot of there's some sort of emotion behind that, like they're all lying to us, this sort of thing. The world isn't round, or whatever it might be. Sort of, why aren't the mainstream media covering this? Linked to something by NBC, linked to something by CNN. I see it all the time.
I've done a few of those.
I mean, it's like, but they are. You're literally linking to something from what you would call the mainstream media. Yeah. So there's a bit of that. There are some valid criticisms, though. There's some genuine criticisms that I think the media needs to engage with in terms of we're largely based in London. The majority of the legacy media is based in London, and you see a slightly different world from London as you do from Lancashire, as you know. We're largely from professional backgrounds, lots of privately educated kind of people, but in the decision-making sort of sphere, if you like. So that's not representative. So I think there are problems that the media need to address. There are areas that the media needs to evolve in terms of connecting with people more effectively. There are valid criticisms, but I think the kind of the sort of emotion, the shoutiness, the kind of you can tune it out. You do occasionally get it when you do occasionally get hostile reactions on the street, but it's quite rare. Mostly people are friendly, interested, courteous, and if people have an opinion, mostly they're very happy to discuss it with you, and I'm very happy to discuss it generally, if I've got the time, with anyone. So Yeah, I've never found personally. I've never found it a problem, and I don't find it. I think the media behaves a lot better now than it used to when I started in journalism. With where the tabloids were up to all sorts of all sorts of things that weren't particularly morally justified and so on. So I think that there's always been some concerns about the media of one sort or another. Now they seem to be mostly politically loaded. Most come from a particular worldview. But no, it's not hard at all. I mean, don't read the comments if if you don't want to see what people's views are. Don't read the comments. And if you do read the comments, understand that that's not necessarily a representative selection of people. So yeah, not hard at all. I love my job. I really enjoy it. I accept that there are some valid criticisms of what we all do, but none of that affects me on a day-to-day basis. And I think most of my colleagues would say the same, but I obviously not here as an avatar for them or a spokesperson. So
Yeah, I mean, from my own perspective, one of the things that it seems to me, and that disappoints me, I think needs to be stopped from being allowed to continue or minimized, is that, and maybe this is my perception of it anyway, is that because of the way the rise of social media, and because of the reduction of people's attention spans and how people are engaged online, what engages them, what gets them engaging with a service, a platform, a product, a content provider, be that news, be that hashtag influencer, be that whatever. Because of that change, I think that legacy media creators, producers, what should we call them? Legacy media platforms, right? I think that they are fighting a battle between, hypothetically, between when they're choosing to run stories, a battle between a news report or an event or a thing that should be reported, public interest, actual relevant story that is important to society on the one hand, and on the other hand, you've got how much attention a story could get because of the type of story it is. So on the icebreaker, I can't remember if we were talking about on air or off air, but you gave the example of years ago when you first joined, or even in the 70s, a crime, if it was a black person on a white person crime, that would be worthy. They knew that would get more attention than a white person on a white person crime. So that would be useful in terms of engagement. You would get, not clicks back then, paper sales and all the rest of it.
yeah,
Right?
I'm not sure if it ever translated to paper sales. I don't really know, but what I do know from personal experience is that there were some straight up racist practices back in the day. I'm not sure if that was commercially driven or whether that was just people being racist in positions of power. But I don't think any of that. I don't think.
Okay, I'll give you an example, hypothetical example right now. So there's this, let's say it's 2 years ago. There's a story. There's one story which is, it's just I don't know, the actual event is some self-defense, violent crime, self-defense, violence involved. It's a white person hitting a black person. This is totally hypothetical, but there can be examples like this, right? White person hitting a black person, and so you got that story, which is chose to be run as a story as in the black victim narrative, when all of the facts and the information point to not a victim, was actually self-defense on the white part. Or you've got any situation where a police officer is stopping a black person for a supposed crime. Then 2 or 3 years ago, sometimes even now, that would get fired. That was a story with the skin color highlighted in order to generate the wrong kind of attention to the story for the wrong reasons, right?
Not sure where you're going with this. I mean, I
So
would.
choosing to run a story like that compared to another story which is actually an important piece of news
But I
about
mean,
X, Y, or Z
mostly
thing.
it's not comparative, right? So if you have a newspaper, you cover. I mean, I don't know, but if you've got 4 stories on a page and you've got 40 editorial pages, right? You don't really have to decide. It's not between one or the other. You can run both. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure, where you run one, how you select what you decide is on your front page and what you decide is on page 13 or whatever. Obviously, obviously has an influence. But I'm not sure. I'm not really sure what the question
Okay,
is.
I'm not
If
explaining
I'm
myself
honest,
very well. I'm not explaining myself. I think okay. I think there's too much. Okay, I think that headlines have been put together and stories being put front and center and prioritized as like what people are most likely to see over are the smaller stories. Be that in print, less in print, but certainly on social media and not social media websites. The first page of the BBC or name any other outlet. I think on those front pages, you are less likely to get things that are actually important as genuine pieces of news compared to something is going to get more likely to get interaction and clicks.
um, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, there's a balance, right? So most let's say newspapers are all commercial. They exist as businesses. They need to make money. If they don't make money, they don't exist
That's part
anymore.
of the problem.
So, and some newspapers don't make money and are owned by people who are prepared to, take a loss in order to be a newspaper owner, in order to influence public opinion, or whatever it might be. But most of the legacy media is exists commercially. Um, so yeah, if you own a newspaper, you need to sell papers. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, right? Uh, we all so the company I work for is a broadcaster. We're sort of regulated, and we're public service broadcasters. So we have, we don't have the kind of freedom that a purely commercial operation would have, but we do. Again, we're a commercial operation. People need to watch us. If our viewing figures goes down to nothing, our bosses will say, "Is this the best use of our airtime?" The BBC have to justify the license fee. So again, they, people have to be watching them. Um, so there's a balance, isn't there? But I mean, there's lots and lots of stories that are really important, that we cover all the time, that are absolutely in the public interest, that don't get clicks, don't get likes, and that we're not doing for that reason. I don't think I've ever approached a story thinking this is going to do really well online. That's just not what interests me. A good example, Blast TBI, which we were talking about before.
Hmm.
It's not exactly it's not exactly clickbait. It's pretty niche as an interest,
Yeah.
right? It's a fascinating story. Something is going badly wrong here. It needs to be. It's absolutely in the public interest that reporters get on board with this, and and I'm trying to do that, and trying to highlight those issues. It's never going to do well on YouTube or on. It's not. We're not doing it because loads of people are going to say, "Wow, this is amazing."
Yeah.
It's public interest journalism. So the answer to your question, I think, is we can do both. Both those things. I think we can be popular in terms of, people watching, people reading, people clicking, or whatever it may be, and also do serious sort of journalism that doesn't have broad popularity. They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah. I think it's too. Yeah.
I mean, you don't select your guests on the basis of how many people are going to watch them on YouTube, right? You select your guests on the basis of how interesting they are to you personally, right?
Yeah, but I've got an advantage. I'm able to do that because I'm not reliant on this production as my survival. Right now, you know,
But I'm not directly, right? I mean, my bosses are somewhere in the chain, right? Somewhere up there, somebody does obviously have to crunch the figures, and somebody has to make those figures work, and that's fine. But most journalists don't have that as a kind
no,
of
the journalists
journalists.
don't.
We
I
come
think
in and we do stories, and we do the stories we want to do broadly, and we do the stories where we get choice. We either doing the obvious sort of agenda type stories that are happening now that you need to report, or where we get a choice to look into things in a bit more detail. We do the things that interest us, that energize us, that we think need you know need to be exposed. So I've got a privilege to have access, not sole unique access to me. There's a whole process of getting things on air that involves an awful lot of people agreeing that this is a story that's worth telling. But I've got an access to a platform, a powerful platform that most people don't have, right? So if I see something like Blast TBI, if I come across a story like that, I feel it's a responsibility to try and use that platform to try and make things better. That's got nothing to do with clicks or views or anything else. The challenge for me is to persuade, obviously, my managers and the people who allocate the funding that this is worthwhile. But the question has never been asked about whether how many people are going to click about that online, how many, how that works commercially. The questions are asked are, what's it going to cost? How does it fit in our budget? How will it fit against other things? Is this a good story? Essentially, nobody ever asks
Well,
whether
what's the difference?
whether it's
So,
niche or not.
yeah,
That's not a factor. It's not a daily sort of factor.
yeah, maybe
I'm not
not on
saying
a
it's not a factor
journalist
in the
level.
kind of manager's offices somewhere, but that's not something that affects what we do in a daily basis on
Do you
the
not
road.
think though? I know, yeah, not the journalist level, right? Because the decision of where and how that story is going to be used is not down to the journalist, right, or the reporter,
Well, it's
is
down
it?
to journalists. Yeah, I mean the guys who sort of sort a running order in television or
Yeah.
the layout in newspapers are journalists too. Ultimately the editor has the ultimate say on what your lead story is, what your back page is, what the in newspapers, and similarly, our editor has ultimate responsibility. But they're overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, journalists by background. They've done time doing other things and worked their way up to be the editors. Some more quickly than others. So
Maybe my perception of it is completely wrong then. Maybe, and the reason reason I've been thinking that, apart from just from what I think I see when I'm looking at things online, I rarely buy a newspaper anymore. But one of the reasons is because I think, well, not I think, I know that newspaper sales have gone down, and television views or whatever is on TV have gone down. Gone down being the polite way to put it, and so for legacy media, I think that they've moved slower than the speed of people's attention. Social media has progressed, so that they've found like a big drop in revenue, and are chasing the tails to try and pick that revenue back up in a way that the only way that it appears it can be done these days, which is through trying to get engagement on social media through posts going out.
I mean, I speak personally. I don't feel under any pressure to drive revenue up through clicks. I feel pressure to do the story of the day or the stories of the day as well as we can, and to do those things that take more time and more investment. To do the things I want to do that interest me and that engage me, I think are important. So I don't feel that pressure personally. Is there a pressure? Will News at 10 ever have 17 million viewers again, as they once did under Trevor McDonald? No, those days have gone. But that democratization of the media is a good thing, right? I view it as a positive because people have people have an incredible amount of choice about what they consume. How people use that, obviously, there's bad things to that as well as good things, but broadly it's positive. And what it allows to happen is, so previously, if you wanted to to buy a professional quality television camera, sound recording equipment, and and then somehow to be able to broadcast that 20 years ago, that was a substantial investment that was totally beyond what any normal individual could do, right? And now here we are in a studio that has cost, I don't know, but a reasonable
Hundreds of thousands, Paul.
hundreds of thousands. Is
Hundreds
that
of
right?
thousands, honestly.
But you can set up now as a camera operator, filmmaker, documentarian for the kind of money that an average small business might invest in a startup, right? It's not totally beyond your reach. So that kind of democratizes the media, right? That allows people like yourselves to have a space, to have a platform, right, of your own that you control and that you use however you want to use it. And I think that's great. Now, whether people engage with it, the extent to which people engage with it, how responsible these, a lot of new media channels are in the sense that they're not regulated in any way, that there's no requirement for fact checking or whatever. There are problems with that, but I think people aren't stupid. The public aren't stupid. I think people can generally, right, people can make their own mind up about what is kind of regulated, what is fact checked, what isn't. There is a problem, I think, where people get into an echo chamber politically of seeking their own political views, wanting them reflected back to them, and therefore not exposing themselves to alternative views. That's a problem that exists for sure. But I think broadly, the kind of spread of new media, the democratization of media, the ability of anyone to get into the media, if you like, to put things out, to explore things, to ask questions, to create content. I think that's fantastic. I think that's great. Why should it be the preserve of a kind of small number of people who happen to go through sort of training and interviews and get into a particular job? We fulfill different roles. What you do is different from what I do. Do you know what I mean? And we do them in different ways. But the public has a choice. You could watch ITV News for weeks without seeing anything relevant to Veterans Affairs or to the military on it, just because that's not a standard kind of part of our agenda. But now you've got the option, rather than waiting for something to come up that interests you, now I can go onto the HR podcast and fill my boots. And that's fantastic. So I don't think it's, yeah, it obviously commercially it's a challenge. Plainly, that's true from that point of view. But I don't think it's changed what we do fundamentally. We all have our own social media output now. We all have, you know, a presence. Legacy media all has a presence online somewhere. So it's changed to that extent. But in terms of changing what we do editorially, I don't detect that. I don't think that is the case.
Well,
Are
that's
we
refreshing,
conscious of, look, let me revise that. Do we see things online that we think, oh, that would be good on telly too? Yeah, we do. You know, there's sort of viral videos might make it to our And Finally or something like that. So there is an influence. There is a sort of crossover, no question. But I don't think it fundamentally changes our journalism. Yeah, that's not something I would recognise.
Yeah, it's refreshing to hear you talk like that, and it's definitely. I mean, it's definitely. I mean, you're changing the way I think about things. It's making me feel a bit better because I've been so miserable about it over the last few years. But one of the reasons I think I've been miserable about the quality of legacy media out there is actually something you touched on. You touched on an icebreaker, and you touched on it again just now. And I think that is again because of the way things have moved so quickly over the last 15 years. That not only has legacy media been impacted, everything's been impacted, but individuals have been impacted. And many people, I know you're saying people aren't stupid. No, but I think many people are now unintentionally, whoever is unintentionally ignorant of things because they've been caught in an echo chamber. And that is because, or that is evident in, people who, for example, will only ever watch the BBC for their news, right? Or their radio channels. My dad is almost exclusively BBC everything, 24 hours a day, almost exclusively. But he's of a different generation. Then you've got other people these days who are, there are people who are exclusively Andrew goddamn Tate. There are people who are exclusively Russell Brand. There are people who are exclusively Joe Rogan. Not that Joe Rogan's a news person, but he's a podcaster. They're exclusive. They just in these one channels where there's something. They've got something from it at one point for some reason. Something's resonated for some reason, and that's all they consume. And Andrew Tate is very clever with this. In that, and this is not me saying I like Andrew Tate. I do not like that individual, but very clever, and in that, and this is he. He will say some things which are very positive, common good messages, bog standard, like no brainer. Look after yourself, well-being, attitude, motivation, all this stuff, right? Majority of what he says is nonsense and like horrendous. And who he is, I don't like the person, what he does. But these little snippets of actual pieces of good advice you hear from somewhere else, they get hooks into people, and all of a sudden people think he's the Messiah. Russell Brand does some great independent. I mean, who'd have thought how many ever years ago that Russell Brand would be an independent journalist right now, which I suppose he is. But he does some amazing stuff. But that's not to say everything that comes out of his mouth is like 100% true and accurate. Some of what he says is pretty wild, and I'm not even talking about the comedy stuff. And the same goes for the legacy media platforms. So the ignorance of the public is a problem as well. And I was influenced by it too.
But I mean, that's why, right? That's why I
don't like legacy media, but I don't stay away from it. I deliberately will consume it because sometimes I get good information from it. Other times I want to see what the lay of the land is. Who's saying what about what? The three main ones I'll go to is for Al Jazeera, GB News, Sky News, BBC. Because you've got to have these variety of sources.
Yeah, I think there's I mean, that's a good point. I think that, it helps if you're a bit media literate. You don't need to do like media studies or anything to know that having more than one source of information is probably healthy, generally speaking. Um, so yeah, I mean, the answer to that echo chamber problem is for people, that there are a variety of media out there, and you can consume them. But all I'd say is there is a difference between, we sort of say independent journalist. I'm not sure I would categorize Russell Brand first and foremost as an independent journalist, or Andrew Tate, but
I
perhaps
think you
that's
describe him. I think
perhaps
well,
that takes us into
Tate not as
sort
a
of,
journalist,
maybe
but
that takes us
as an
into semantics.
influencer.
But
Yeah, yeah.
we would regard ourselves
Do that.
as,
Do they take that off for me?
sorry.
Take that lanyard off for me.
Oh gosh.
I've just noticed it. Sorry.
Um,
sorry.
so yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think people who rely on, if you're relying on those sorts of people for the news, then I think that's that's going to give you a slightly sort of stilted sort of worldview. But that's people are people. There's a freedom to choose there. I don't think that's fundamentally a bad thing. Um, you know, I, I think people have always been able to do that. There's lots of people who've never read a newspaper. That's kind of fair enough. If you don't want to, you don't want it.
Yeah.
We don't have to force that onto people. And if you want to be in the public sphere, you want to be engaged with the world around you, then obviously the more you read and the more you consume in terms of the media, the better informed you'll be, and the more valid your opinions will be, the more likely you are to be listened to. But I don't think you can't make people. If people want an echo chamber, if that's where they feel comfortable, if they just want their own political views reflected back to them and they want the facts to fit their view, and they don't want to talk about facts that don't fit their view, that's kind of a freedom that people have, right? I think it's kind of
I know, but if
fine.
if there was one lesson I could teach to everyone now and clip my fingers, it would be that you don't want an echo chamber. No one should want an echo chamber in any circumstance whatsoever. I don't think. At all. I
I
don't
mean,
see any benefit to it.
I think most intelligent people like to challenge themselves intellectually, just naturally. And I'm not saying intelligent people as in people with degrees. I mean, just normal people who have an interest in the world around them, right? Are up for challenging themselves. And you only have to sit in a pub with a group of young people and listen to the conversations to understand that people are still interested in the world around them. They do still discuss politics with a small p, not just party politics. They do discuss world affairs. Those things do matter to people, and generally speaking, so that whether or not that translates into huge viewing figures for ITV News or BBC kind of doesn't matter so much.
Yeah.
People now can, they consume our content in different ways online and so on, as well as on sort of terrestrial broadcast.
Yeah.
And the same for the newspapers. Newspaper articles fly online as well. Even if the viewing figures for the hard copy is down. And B, there's this democratization. They can also watch the H hour. They can also watch whatever else it is they want to watch. I think that, the movement's been really quick because technology's enabled it. But I don't think it's bad. I think it's a good thing. I think the way the media is going is a good thing. Yes, it has problems. Yes, it has challenges. There've always been problems. There've always been challenges. Do you know what I mean? That's, that the way everything's going, I think, is an absolute positive. I'm always an optimist with with most things in life, but certainly with the media. If our viewing figures get to such a point where I, get sacked, then have me back on and I might sing a different tune. But I think the media's in a really healthy place, personally.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Really?
Yeah.
So,
Because as a consumer, you can find whatever you want to find. Now, if you wallow in it, an echo chamber in it, okay, but that's on you. Well, if I want something, just from a point of view of research now, if I'm looking at, let's say, for instance, Blast TBI, right, that we've spoken about before, I can find incredible content from Australia, some of which is ABC, the big broadcaster there, their health correspondent's been doing really, really powerful work on that. But also, there are veterans there, people who are afflicted by this, who are putting research online, blogging on it, creating communities, right? This didn't exist even 15 years ago. This was not possible. Now I can connect to these guys in Australia and talk about what's happening there, learn from them about what's happening there, and have a whole new sort of information stream that's available to me. Same in the United States, Sweden, Canada, and I can connect to all of these people and all of these communities and all of these discussions, and I can take what's useful to me and leave what isn't. But
You-
that's a capacity that didn't exist 15 years ago. It just wasn't there. And now that people are using social media, they're using blogging, they're using podcasts, they're using all this stuff that's available to us now. And there's an incredible amount of fantastic content out there, and it's not all the preserve now of the legacy media, but that's good for us too, right? Because we can use that and turn that into, hang on a sec, these guys here are doing something that we should be doing.
Yeah, I agree with that. Sorry, when you were saying media's legacy media's in a healthy state, I was thinking you meant in terms of financial health and business model health.
No, I'm talking journalistically. So from a business point of view, yeah, I mean, it's a challenging time. But I mean, when I started journalism, I went to a college in. So I think I'm one of the only people ever to actually find a job from the resettlement. The resettlement computer thing you used to have, and
Yeah,
it
yeah.
sort of you go on do this psychometric thing, don't you?
Was
And
it the
it says,
career transition partnership back then? Was it?
I can't remember what they called it, but you
I
went
don't
to
think it was.
Aldershot and you sat in front of a computer that was like the size of a house, and
Yeah.
and you sort of typed in, your favorite color or whatever, and it said, you be a good teacher. I can't remember what the other things, psychologist or something.
Yeah.
There was a sort of little list of jobs that it thought I'd be good at, and a journalist was one of them. And then you could go on you had to go to a different computer to find out what courses might be available for these things and what the requirements were and whether you needed a degree and whatever. And it turned out you didn't need a degree to go into journalism, and so which most of the others did. And so I sort of typed this in, and there was a college course.
And you could bring your crayons with you.
You could bring your crayon, exactly. And so that's kind of how I ended up in journalism. So. I had thought about it before. It wasn't like totally new to me, but it was, that was so that got me into college. So I went to college, and the first day, the sort of senior lecturer, the first thing he said was sort of, ladies and gentlemen, you're joining a dying industry. Newspapers of these newspaper titles.
What year was this?
This was in 93.
You
93
saying it then?
or 94, 90,
Pre-internet.
no, 93. So you're
Pre-internet.
joining a dying industry, reading figures are down, it's terminal decline. Of all these newspapers, only one or two will be in business in 5 years' time. I think he said, he might have said, I'll be generous to him and say 10 years' time. So all of those titles are still going, except today, newspaper closed.
But
the standard's gone on, there have been changes, but nearly all of those newspaper titles are still with us. So I'm not saying they're thriving necessarily. I'm not saying the business model is that they're all cracking open champagne every time the reading figures come through, but they're all still with us, and that's 30 years on. So you can exaggerate you can catastrophize about where the legacy media is heading a bit, because it still has a really valuable role in the ecosystem to have something that is fact checked, that is, in the case of broadcasters, regulated. That everything has to be verified, that it has to be balanced, has to be fair, has to be accurate, and all that sort of stuff. There's a place for that. I'm not saying that's the only thing people should be consuming. We were talking earlier, the more people consume, the better. But within that sort of ecosystem, there's an absolute place for straight, fact-checked news. And I think there always will be. And the newspapers, I think younger people, far less likely to read newspapers. But, I still read newspapers, not even so much for the news sometimes. Crosswords, sports. There's something about sitting in the garden with a newspaper that is better than sitting there on your phone for me.
yeah, but that is that is
maybe that's a generational
thing. That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. Go and try and put a newspaper into someone's hand these days. I mean, it's hard to get young people to read books, voluntarily
Yeah, no,
outside of
true.
school. But so all right, so question then. So if newspaper sales and viewing figures have dropped off, right? And they were both a source of, the main source of revenue for legacy media platforms, then where has that revenue been picked up?
But I mean, the answer is I don't know. I'm a journalist. I don't have any responsibility, thank goodness, for the kind of business side of things. But ITV is advertiser funded. Advertising goes up and down, not just with viewing figures, with other factors as well. But when things go down, we make efficiencies like any other business, and when things go up, we try and expand our offering and our operation. I think with newspapers, the same thing. Sort of advertising's, newspapers are no longer the only place you can advertise. So, but I don't think it's like, I wouldn't over catastrophize it. I think where there's been a real problem, where there is a real change that's noticeable, is in local newspapers. I think if you look at local newspapers now, that obviously classifieds used to pay for those essentially, and much of that business has gone online, and that is, I think that's a lot harder for the local. So they're nearly all owned by 2 or 3 big groups now, which wasn't the case. They used to be fiercely independent, and right around the country with these really small 3, 4, 10-person operations doing incredible work of covering their patch, their local area. And now you might have one guy who covers all of a whole London borough or a whole county or whatever. So plainly there is a guy, or I mean guy in a gender neutral sense, but so plainly there is, that the quality of local newspaper journalism has definitely taken a hit. They've definitely they've taken a massive commercial hit, and the quality of journalism has suffered as a result. I don't think there's any question about that. I would say at sort of national newspaper network news level, not dramatic. I don't think it's dramatically. I don't think journalism's any different than it was when I joined.
Yeah.
People like to look back at a golden era of journalism when we would sort of, fly across the world and spend 3 weeks, 5 weeks on a story and only file once and have, expense accounts that, the journalism was no better then. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't. We can do incredible things now. We can bring you things from like anywhere in the world live almost that we couldn't do back then. We have, there's some things might have been better about this, but some things are better about that. There was never a kind of golden age where everything was perfect. It didn't exist, So, and it's interesting to look back at, if you look back on old archive news reports and so on, some of them were fantastic. Like some of them are now. Some of them are awful, as some of them are now. I don't think that I think it's particularly healthy to always be looking back at something that was better than it is now. I genuinely don't think that. I think some of the journalists we have working for us now are every bit as good as the kind of legends of the past. Every bit as good.
Are there any so from on an independent journalism topic, are there independent journalists that you would recommend to follow alongside the legacy media platforms? Is there anyone that
Don't
pops into
really
your
think
mind?
it's my place to do that. I think it doesn't feel right to do that because it's a personal. There's people I follow and then I don't follow for a while. So no, not really. Yeah, kind of rather not do that. Yeah.
No,
There
that's
are
fine.
I generally, mostly I would say I consume legacy media. Generally speaking, I will go where I come across independent journalists, it's through rabbit holes, it's through being interested in a subject, so it's topic specific. So, Veterans Affairs, the same people that are people that I would consume from time to time, but I'm not sure I'd recommend them. I like, I kind of use them specifically for a thing. There's not much that I would just listen to for pleasure. It's mostly because I'm interested in a thing. So I follow some sports podcasts, but I do them because I'm interested in a particular football team, and I follow them and I consume that
Yeah.
content that's related to that. So, I could say I like this podcast or I like that, but ultimately they're not. I'm just following them because they're subject specific. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no,
And
that's
that's the
fine.
great thing about independent journalism in that sense about the democratization of the media is I can now find like 15 different channels on my football team and, podcasts and YouTube channels and all sorts just on, and it's not even a big football team. It's like, that was, you just couldn't do that 15 years ago. Some of it's garbage, obviously, but you can kind of pick and choose. So I think that's great.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So one thing that surprised me, and you may be able to explain this, maybe, either specifically about this story or using another example, but it is the Keir Starmer, the 3 Ukrainians and the arson story.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that has really surprised me is well, I see this as being major story that for some reason I think should, or in alternate circumstances will be getting covered on a daily basis until we found out what it was all about. Prime
They've been charged,
Minister,
right?
security breaches, Prime Minister, three people, not one, Ukrainians as well, and
They've been charged.
I am not sure. I'm not sure, but
I think so. One of the reasons that, and this is a thing that where independent media, if you like, or where people generally are, I think, and maybe this is actually an issue for us, that we don't do a good enough a job of explaining why we're not covering certain things. But generally speaking, when somebody is arrested, and very certainly when they're charged with an offence, there's very little we can say about that until the court case, and that's governed by the Contempt of Court Act, which you learn all about in in journalism school. And essentially, it's to safeguard the trial, to make sure that the jury aren't influenced by media coverage. So up until the point where proceedings are active, you can say what you like. I mean, there are other things that kick in. There are other restrictions on our freedom of speech, like libel and so on and so forth. But there's no restriction legally on us commenting on things. Once proceedings are active, and there's a sort of slight grey area over whether that's arrest or charge, but we generally speaking, once somebody's charged, there's a real limit, a strict limit to what we can discuss about the case. So, and that's for a very good reason. I mean, obviously, as a journalist, one doesn't like any restrictions on freedom of speech. But to an extent, you also have to recognise that some of those restrictions are there for a very good reason. And if a jury's already made their mind up about whether someone's guilty or not because they've been reading about it online or in the Sun or in the Mail or on ITV News, whatever, every day up until the trial, then that obviously means they're not getting a fair trial. So that's the reason why these things don't get reported in real time. Come the trial, I can absolutely guarantee you we'll report that. You know, and so will the rest of the media, because
you think it's more likely this is a contempt of court, potentially a contempt
100% a contempt of court thing. It's just not something we can do. And a really good example of that is probably one of the most famous of the independent journalists, if you credit him with that title, was Tommy Robinson, who went to jail for precisely that, right? And he knew what he was doing.
He's just been released as well, hasn't he?
He's just been released, yeah. But he knew about the contempt of court, but obviously felt that was something he wanted to push and test. And you know, maybe it was right for him to do that. But the bottom line is that, you know, there's a reason we're not reporting on this grooming trial because we don't think it's newsworthy. It's just there's a limit to what we can do. If there are reporting restrictions in place, if there's contempt of court issues, that means we can't report them. And there are, in fairness, we do challenge reporting restrictions. We do challenge these things in court all the time. But there is a genuinely good reason for society why people should be able to have a fair trial if they're accused of serious offences.
Those restrictions would not be applicable on independent journalists, then, would they?
Well, technically, yeah. I mean,
they are applicable.
Technically speaking, yes. So as Tommy Robinson found out, yeah, absolutely. If there's a court order that says you can't report the identity of this person, that's a court order for everybody. So they're applicable for everybody. We obviously have lawyers who you know will advise, and we have a kind of infrastructure that makes it easier for us to observe those things. You know, sometimes people don't know about that, might be commenting, let's say, about this trial that you mentioned, and you know, you might fall foul of those things. But technically speaking, you're every bit as, you know, journalists are just citizens. We don't have there's no rights that we have, and there's no responsibilities that we have that you don't, basically. So if we're talking about the details of that trial that you happen to know about for whatever reason right now, and those people have been charged, there's a danger that could be viewed as contempt. Yeah, the bar's quite high. You have to seriously prejudice the outcome of the trial, but it's nobody wants to have a trial abandoned. Potentially guilty people walk free because of your reporting. That will be A, will be reputationally bad, B, ethically wrong, and C, you can get fined and imprisoned for it. So yeah, we tend to take contempt of court very seriously.
Yeah. What are the standard, or are there standard processes in place for a journalist to hit minimum requirements for due diligence when due diligence of stories, sources, given information before a story is submitted for publication? Are there any standards? Is there any bar there?
Yeah, I mean, they vary. So it varies with what you're doing. So if what you're doing carries a risk, then the lawyers will go through it with a tooth comb. So if I'm going to say, you know, Hugh Keir runs a terrorist organisation.
Not anymore. Not anymore. I left 3 mate. I left.
Which is good. But you know, if that's the story I'm going to go with, plainly there's a risk that you will sue me for libel, and that my company will have to pay a large amount of money to you because of my lack of diligence. So where we're talking about something like that, like original journalism, or you know, that kind of thing, is pretty rigorous, and it's pretty rigorous for everyone, and it's pretty rigorous for an obvious reason, which is that there's a reputational problem, which actually, if you're someone like the BBC, someone like ITV News, the reputational damage is probably worse than the actual payout. So there's a lot of diligence there. Everything goes through the lawyers. Your sources you need to explain who your sources are. You need to explain where they come from, how you know them. There's a whole series of questions that the lawyers will want to know. If you're reporting on, let's say, day-to-day politics, politician A says this, we'll normally report that politician A says this. We'll then go to politician B and say, politician A just said this. You know, politician B will say that's absolute nonsense. That's completely true. If it's something that, and I think we're getting better at this, of fact-checking politician A, but it's hard in real time. And also politics has sort of moved and shifted a bit in terms of their kind of willingness to state things that are just blatantly not true. And so we're slowly getting a bit more rigorous in terms of challenging those things as they come, rather than just reporting them and then reporting a rebuttal. I think we're probably getting better at now, I would say, actually challenging in the first place. But so it depends on the story. The level of kind of rigor that goes into to examining stuff depends very much on the story. But nothing goes on air that isn't checked by a lawyer in terms of BBC, ITV News, Channel 4, whatever. Everything goes through the lawyers that's contentious or potentially contentious. So we literally have in-house lawyers all the time who every day for every broadcast will check anything legal, any court reports, anything with potential for libel, potential for privacy breaches, potential for contempt of court, anything that might get us in trouble is rigorously checked.
Yeah, I think one of the issues with that is, I think it's too easy to be able to publish something which is published as a fact and is incorrect, and later corrected via, for example, an apology or correction on a website like the BBC has it. You know, I think all of the, well, they must do, all the platforms have a way of doing it. A page where they have a list of corrections that they've had to make.
Yeah, listen, nothing's perfect, is it? No one's perfect. And if you take a newspaper, if you look at the amount of content in that newspaper, and then you remind yourself that this was all done from scratch today, in a day, and sent to the printers, and printed, and distributed, right? This is happening at speed. All of this is happening at speed. So ITV News and BBC put out 3 different programs a day from scratch, as well as those 3 different programs a day. There's kind of online content, there's live streaming on various platforms, there's social media content and so on. An incredible amount of work that's happening at pace, and judgment calls being made at pace and quickly. So, you know, do mistakes happen? Yeah, of course, they always have, and they always will. And it's right that they should be corrected. Some mistakes are more egregious than others. Some mistakes are a function of changing expectations in society, changing laws. So if you look at privacy, for instance, back when I started in journalism, privacy didn't exist. You know, there wasn't such a thing. You could go up to people's doorsteps with a camera rolling if you thought they were bad guys and ask them questions. You could film people through their windows. I wouldn't say we made a habit of that, certainly not at ITV News, but I mean, it was all about what you thought was the right thing to do. There wasn't a law. There was no legal underpinning for that. And then obviously the Max Mosley case was a big breakthrough in terms of privacy. And now privacy is a big thing. You know, the news helicopters, you know, if you're filming somebody in their garden, inadvertently, you're following a motorcade, let's say, and then potentially that's an issue. So the law changes, society's expectation changes. So some things it's not like they're mistakes necessarily. It's like an evolution in the way things, in the way the media works, if you like. So some of it's that, and some of it is just honest to goodness human error. You know, one of the things that absolutely infuriates me the most about our job is, as to mistakes on maps and things like that, and
Is what? Sorry.
when people put the wrong names on maps and things like that,
Yeah.
and in graphics and so on, and I mean, it's really infuriating and it's embarrassing when that happens. But nobody wants that. I mean, this is people working at pace and making a genuine kind of good faith mistake. I don't think it's a symptom of any deep malaise. You could argue that perhaps the people who once used to fact check those things are no longer there because we're all leaner and we're all slimmer. There's probably some truth in that.
There's a good movie actually on that on Netflix at the minute. I'm just looking for the name of it. It's got Keira Knightley in it. Netflix journalist. 1 second, and this is a good example of that. And you'll probably laugh. I imagine you've experienced something like this, or with someone else doing it. Wait a second. What is it called? Not Black Doves. What the heck is it? I can't remember what it's called. But in the film, there's a leak, and they get all of a story. They not leak. They publish this story, and in the story, there's an email that they from a spy. Yes, I can't remember what it is. In fact, it's based on a true story. It's based on a true story. I'm sure it's based on the Iraq War, weapons of mass destruction. Hang on a minute. WMDs. Anyway, in it, the person who is checking the story for grammar and punctuation runs the story through a spell checker, which then changes the spelling of this email, which was leaked to them, from American spelling to British spelling, and then when it's published, it's called that. That's not true. That's bullshit. It wouldn't be spelled like that. It's
Right,
spelled
yeah.
American. This is invented. This is made up, and it means that the public think the whole story is
Yeah,
BS. It's not.
that sounds like a good example. It's it's a good faith error. It's a sloppy error. And we do. Obviously, none of us sorry set out to make mistakes on purpose, but they do happen, and you don't have to look. You can see them because nowadays they go online straight away and they bounce around on X or on Twitter, and mistakes are amplified in a way that they weren't previously now. So particularly funny sort of maps where you've got the wrong country name in the wrong country and so on. That's which I can't remember us doing, but it does happen.
Official Secrets.
Oh,
Official
I've not seen
Secrets.
it.
This is 2019. Okay, a British drama. I highly recommend it. Directed by Gavin Hood, based on the case of whistleblower Catherine Gunn, who exposed an illegal spying operation by American and British intelligence services to gauge sentiment of and potentially blackmail UN diplomats tasked to vote on a resolution regarding the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Yeah, it's a really good film. But
Yeah,
in that,
sounds
it's
good.
basically a spell check mistake in well, I can't remember which organization it is who published the story. Anyway, sorry. Yeah. So
But yeah, I mean, in terms of it being too easy to make mistakes, I mean, it's too easy to make mistakes driving. It's too easy to make, these are things that are happening at pace. And the only thing I'd accept probably is that, like you say, the guy whose job it is to check things probably used to be 3 people who would probably check, and maybe they would have been very experienced and therefore quite expensive people. Now that we kind of, everything's leaner, tighter, cheaper, mistakes are more likely to creep in that sense. Perhaps that's true. I'm not sure whether that's empirical, whether if you sort of did on-air mistakes for a year at this particular broadcaster in pick a year and then did it for this year, whether there would actually be a difference. There might be. I don't know. But I don't think, I think a few of those mistakes are major. I can't remember. And it's right that if you make a mistake, you should correct yourself. And it's right that if that mistake has, I mean, most mistakes are kind of innocent spelling mistakes, whatever. But I think where you make a mistake that has like implications for people, you should correct that. I think that's entirely responsible.
Yeah. So can we come up with the subject of blast TBIs? Is that all right? Never seen someone so happy about TBIs. Yeah, you mentioned the icebreaker. You mentioned it earlier on, and I've done a few interviews on this. I've got a real keen interest in it, and a lot of my listeners and viewers have as well, for various reasons. Some are directly impacted by it either themselves or by a family member. And so, how have you ended up covering blast TBIs as a story? in general?
So there's a friend of mine who I say friend, he's a guy I interviewed. I met and interviewed through another story, basically something totally unrelated. It was about 3-power in Afghanistan, actually. It is a sort of project I did a few years ago, and we've sort of stayed in touch. And this guy has been saying to me, "You need to do something on Blast TBI. You need to be looking at
Who is
this."
this?
I'm not sure I'll mention his name publicly.
Okay.
He may not
That's
want me to do so, but he's a really fantastic guy and really kind of inquiring, intelligent sort of individual with excellent service record and just a good person. And he's been sort of gently sort of prodding me a bit to do it. And obviously, you get quite a lot of that when you're a journalist. Why aren't you doing this? You should have a look at that. And it assumes that you've got all the time in the world to do that, which I don't. You have I have a sort of, my job's quite all consuming. So carving out time to do stuff that isn't agenda stuff is perfectly possible, but it's not easy. So I sort of said, I put him off a bit, and then said, at some point I said, sort of, look, I'll do a reading day on it. I will have a look at this. And did a reading day on it. And I just couldn't believe what I was reading. He sent me a load of stuff, including your Mandy Bostwick. You did, didn't you? You did it. That part of, amongst other things.
episode 99, folks. If you want to listen to that
Episode
one. Mandy
99.
Bostwick. Yeah.
There you go. So
Well, that was an eye opener for me when I first started talking to her, and it was like, oh,
well, I think
God.
she's been one of the. I think she probably watches what happens in the media now and thinks I've been saying this for a decade. Which in fairness to her, she has. So, and that amongst other things. So I've went through that, and then I thought, well, this can't it can't be true, or it can't be
Well, what was the thing that was shocking you?
The shocking thing. So it didn't shock me at all that primary blast waves can cause brain damage in the sense of like being involved in an IED or whatever. It was quite interesting because it tied in with rugby. I don't know if you've read Sam Peters's book Concussion, but it's really fascinating. If you're into rugby at all,
Yeah.
you must read it. It's fantastic.
Whose book?
He's called Sam Peters. He's a journalist for the Daily Mail. He pretty much led the campaign in terms of publicity, in terms of journalism rather than science, to kind of recognise and gain awareness of the fact of the problem of repeat concussions in rugby.
Peterson.
Sorry?
Sam Peterson.
Sam Peterson, is it? Sorry.
I know, I'm asking.
No, Sam Peters, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Go on.
The book's called Concussion.
Oh, I've heard of the book.
Yeah,
okay, right. Okay, right.
So that's a must read if you're interested at all in this sort of sphere. The idea that sort of blasts obviously cause brain damage and that, you get tertiary effects and shrapnel or whatever, that's kind of not surprising at all. What was surprising was not the acute kind of traumatic brain injury thing from IEDs, although that is underreported and comes with an awful lot of challenges in terms of treatment and diagnosis and so on. But the fact that repeated exposure to blast can cause serious neurological damage down the line that may not be symptomatic until many years later, that was like really? And so then I kind of started reading some of the papers on it or the abstracts and so on. And I'm not scientifically trained, but I've, started trying to find counter views and where's the other side of this argument? Where's the science that's this appears to be true, or at least as far as the science takes us. There's a lot we don't know, right? So I think the idea that our own weapons, that the blast overpressure from our own weapon systems are causing brain damage, and that brain damage is kind of cumulative in a way that's not entirely understood, but that at some point that can become symptomatic years down the line, perhaps long after you've left the military, perhaps when you're in a health system where you're going to see a GP who has no idea what you're talking about, and that this is frequently being diagnosed therefore as something else, adjustment disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, whatever it might be. That was amazing to me. And then you think, well, this must be quite niche. How big is this? I mean, what's the scale of this? And the answer is we don't know, but I think it's far bigger than anyone's admitting at the moment officially. And I think, I mean, I say we don't know. I mean, we don't know. It's not just journalists that don't. I genuinely don't think the MOD know. I think that's it is an unknown. But there's an interesting comparison between the American figures, where they've got over 400,000 diagnosed cases amongst their service personnel, and the UK figures, which are a fraction of that. And that's been rationalised by people saying that, you know, that in the United States, TBI is overdiagnosed in order so that people qualify for veterans healthcare, which, you know, lifelong healthcare, which is not, we have obviously a different system with the NHS. And so that doctors are saying, well, you know, we're going to give you this so that you have a code that allows you to access healthcare. The other, that's said a lot by people linked to the MOD or by some sort of, it's something that you hear from time to time. But the alternative is, there's another possibility, right? And the other possibility is that we're underdiagnosing it, because I'm going to my GP and saying I've got these symptoms. These symptoms overlap with PTSD, with adjustment disorder, with depression. The GP doesn't recognize them, sends me to a psychiatrist. I get a mental health diagnosis, and what I've got is not a psychiatric condition. You know from talking to many and so on, what I've got is a physical injury sustained either in and off combat, or potentially, having never been deployed operationally, potentially this could be sustained by exposure to mortars, shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, sniper rifles of the heavier caliber sniper rifles, all the things that we know cause blast overpressure over a certain amount to a damaging amount. So that to me was staggering. I found that amazing. And so that obviously hooked me in as a journalist, right? Why don't I know about this? Why haven't I heard about this? And the other thing that really kind of got me set on it was speaking to Kate England. Have you come across Kate England?
Kate England's been on the podcast.
Kate England's been on the podcast.
And glad to call her a friend, and her husband, James, actually, yeah.
So I think I said before that one of the great things about my job is meeting some of the people you meet who are just inspiring and inspirational people who are against all the odds doing incredible things. And, you know, she's one of those people that's not only holding together a family, caring for James full time, but also campaigning on this. She's like, absolute expertise on it is incredible, but also just the energy to keep campaigning, keep fighting, not take no for an answer. So, you know, so I sort of, having spoken to her, I was just, right, this is the story I want to cover. This is something I want to do. So I've been slowly, bit by bit, working on it ever since. And it's A, fascinating intellectually, and B, it's like, why isn't something being done?
Yeah, the thing is, it makes, when I interviewed Mandy there, it sounds like it was the same penny. It was a penny drop. It was a shock moment, but also like a penny drop moment into how, one of those things you go, oh my God, actually, yeah, it makes total sense. If you think about, boxers and Parkinson's disease as an example, or an other psychological issue that they get, or physiological issue that they get because of repeated blows to the head. Now, those repeated blows to the head, those illnesses aren't caused by the glove hitting the skin of the face. Those illnesses are caused by the shockwave going through the head, and it's the same with, for people who are ignorant to this. Not I don't mean ignorant in a negative way. I mean ignorant is because you just never experienced it. When you're in the military, even just firing a normal, a small caliber weapon, you shoot those things. You've got basically a small explosion happening right next to your head in the barrel, and you get a blast wave come out at the end of the barrel, and has a certain shape profile depending on the weapon system that you're using, and that you feel that in your head. It's literally the bigger the caliber, you mentioned there, the bigger the caliber of the weapon, or changes in the environment in which you're shooting the weapon, your head feels like it's going to explode. You see it on TV, like someone in a car, the other one's in the car in a building, and they're firing a shotgun or a pistol in a vehicle, for example. And I always look at it and go, pff, and they'll carry on talking or something afterwards. The scene carries on, and I'm looking at it and thinking, he wouldn't be carrying on with that conversation.
That's right.
He wouldn't be carrying on. For one, no one would be able to hear anything. And for two, one of you is probably, let's say it's 4 people in the car, one of you is probably going to be in excruciating pain from that enclosed blast in there. It is horrific. And so it doesn't surprise me that of people who are regularly firing weapons or being around explosions, because that's what they are, little explosions, are going to have
Honestly,
issues. And it's not even.
completely surprised me.
It surprised me,
It's
but
maybe
now
my,
it's
maybe
now it's a.
that points to my kind of my ignorance, really, perhaps more than anything else. But I was just, I was just staggered by that.
It also doesn't surprise. It surprised me, right? But what I'm not saying I wasn't surprised. I'm saying that it also made total sense when I sort of went, oh, okay, actually, it makes total sense, and the fact that this symptoms can be delayed onset for a long time also doesn't surprise me, because from a conversation with Mandy, and then I had follow-on conversations with Mark Gordon, we went a lot more scientific on it. Mark Gordon, American doctor,
Yeah,
I've mentioned him to you, who's on this on the US side is doing the equivalent of what Mandy's doing, flying the flag, pushing it forward, but also he's on the science side, research and testing and development of treatments, preventions and treatments of blast TBIs. He was, the way he explained it to me is it's not so much a physical impact. A lot of the TBIs, so blast TBIs, you would struggle to find physical evidence of it, but you wouldn't struggle to find neurophysiological evidence of it. You're more likely to find hormone imbalances in the brain because of it. And so when, as the evidence of it, the hormones are not being produced in a way that is normal because of the experience of the blast. Now, over time, as we get older, obviously our bodies change and the way our hormone balances change.
I think there's a kind of breakthrough that we're close to, I think, which is that the Department of Defense scientists in Boston, Daniel Pearl and Anne McKee, think they've identified a pattern. I'm not sure if they've published on this yet. I don't think they have, but I think Daniel Pearl has done some interviews with
Daniel Pearl.
Yeah, Perl. He's one of the sort of leading neuropathologists in this field, or is working in this field. He's identified a pattern at autopsy that is specific to blast. So previously, there was always this issue of, but have they had concussions in the past? And if you're talking about soldiers, if you're talking about particularly infantry and teeth arms who are more vulnerable to this for obvious reasons, lots of rugby players, lots of boxers, lots of people who have a punch up on Friday night in a bar, lots of just active people who have head injuries anyway, right? So there was a kind of, well, how do we differentiate between, how can we say this is blast? Yes, we accept that there's brain injury here, the scan shows that, or the symptoms show that, or whatever, but that's if you're lucky enough to get beyond a psychiatric diagnosis. But then there's this kind of, but how do we attribute it to blast? And I think what's happening now, and I'm not the expert on this, I just ask the questions and trying to absorb as much knowledge as I can, but I'm no scientific training, no scientific background, zip. So I'm very far from an expert. But I think what's happening now is that they've identified a pattern at autopsy that is specific to blast. So I think that allows.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so that's.
Is this a CTE related?
No, it's not CTE.
Okay.
It's not CTE. It's separate from CTE. It's essentially, so remember that CTE, for instance, there was a large discussion about whether or not it's caused by impact. And eventually it was agreed scientifically that there is no other cause for CTE. You can't get CTE in any other way. And I think the science is heading in that way with blast, where it can be identified, or it will be possible to identify autopsy signatures of blast TBI that as distinct from blunt trauma or other things. That seems to be where it's going, to the best of my knowledge. So that's a potential key, a potential breakthrough, a potential way forward. The other key, it seems to me, is neuroimaging has advanced now to an incredible degree where brain damage can be identified very, very, very specifically and very accurately. What they can't do with neuroimaging at the moment is say specifically this is caused by blast. But in a sense, you don't necessarily need to, right? If I've not had other head trauma, if I have a history of blast exposure and I don't have a history of other head trauma, and I've got physical brain injury, one can make a working assumption, right? So I think neuroimaging is heading rapidly in the direction of it being able to be diagnostic. which it's not at the moment. So, there is progress on this. There is movement on this, mostly from the States. But in fairness to the MOD, they have invested money in it. There is they are researching it. But there's a lot of things that aren't happening, it seems to me. And, it's not my job to campaign on these things or to try to have opinions, but it seems to me reasonable that what we know about it now, which is quite a lot compared to, let's say, a decade ago, the Royal College of GPs, doctors have a leaflet that goes to all GPs and dealing with veterans, specific veterans healthcare issues. So we're more likely to have hearing loss, joint problems, back problems. There are certain sort of health
Because
issues.
of our age, Paul, or because of the
Well, I never carried. I always tried not to carry too much weight, so I'm all right. My back's all right, but my hearing's shot. So there's this leaflet that goes to GPs with these sort of, and psychological problems, PTSD and so on, that tries to help them to recognise problems that might be specific to veterans, and that's a good thing, right? No mention of TBI on this leaflet, nothing. Could be there, should be there. NICE don't approve neuroimaging at the moment. NICE, National Institute of Clinical Excellence, who approve treatments, drugs, medicines, and so on. At the moment, they don't approve neuroimaging. Neuroimaging is at a level now where it can do incredible things. I'm not sure why that's where we are in that process, whether that's something that's imminent or whether it's just something that's not even in progress. I don't know. Coroner's officers, sad to say, but we know that there's a link between TBI, civilian TBI, normal TBI, road crash TBI, right? We know there's a link between that and higher rates of suicide. That's clear in the literature, couldn't be clearer. So does it not follow logically then that if we know veterans are at high risk of blast TBI, does it not follow logically that in some of those cases, people take their own lives as a consequence or with TBI? And if that does follow logically, why aren't inquests dealing with that? So we've looked through loads of inquest reports, a series of prevention of future death reports, but also press reporting of inquests. We've seen every red flag for TBI on some of these terribly sad cases, right? Every red flag for TBI. And it's not being discussed. The families don't know about it. The coroner's officers aren't talking about it. So therefore, brain donation's not happening. And without brain donation at the moment, one can't say. So everything's about PTSD, and the two, as you know, can coincide. They can occur together, and whatever. So I'm not in any way belittling PTSD or any mental health sort of thing. Nobody's suggesting that they're not real and pressing problems. But here's something else, and why is that something else not being also looked at? So, there's a whole awareness thing that should be happening. Partly that's to do with the media, but the government could be doing this, right? I don't see why we should be alert to this. GPs should know about this.
Well, yeah, this is, I remember, when I was talking to Mandy, and that, Mandy, she gets very animated about this and rightly so. Mark does as well, to be fair. And I think it's one of the worst things about this, you've touched on it there, is that there are so many people that should be around today, would be around today, if during their diagnosis and during their treatment of, let's say, PTSD, let's use PTSD as an example, during that those initial assessments, and when they were being looked at, being spoken to work out what the problem was, is that so up until very recently, almost exclusively, that was only a conversation about their psychiatric state, and the only things that were considered for treating them were psychological measures, and omitting and neglecting the neurophysiological side, and there are people who I know, people now who've just said it. This, thankfully, they're still here. How they still here, I don't know, because they've had a miserable existence for a long time, ex-military, and they've done everything that all of the standard treatments that they can go through, CBT, the EMDR,
Yeah.
all these things, go medication, go around the houses, and nothing gets into a position where they're okay. It's like nothing is working for them, and it, again, back to that penny drop moment. It seems madness to me now, in hindsight, granted, that you wouldn't assess both things: the psychological situation and the physiological situation. And Mark Gordon's and Mandy, what they both think is the correct approach here when someone presents with issues. Let's again PTSD, whatever those symptoms of the PTSD, because whatever those symptoms of PTSD could be, depression, anxiety, mood swings, whatever, substance abuse, whatever, is that they argue that the first thing that should be looked at is the neurophysiological side. Because that can be easily addressed straight away, easily addressed, right? It's not a gray area.
So that's the
and
thing.
then see what psychological. So treat that first, get the hormones to where they think they should be, and then look at what psychological symptoms remain.
So
Their argument is that would address most of the issues. Most of these people would not have.
I think that's where we need to go. But there are a number of problems. One of the problems is we don't know much about it. There's so much we don't know about it. It's very heterogeneous as a condition.
It being what?
TBI, blast
Okay,
TBI.
yeah.
But so for PTSD, to your point there, one of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD is that you rule out physical causes, that you've ruled out other causes.
Oh, you mentioned this on the phone to me, actually. Yeah.
In order to diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder, you should have already ruled out physical causes. So the problem comes in, like, how do you do that? Do you do that symptomatically? At the moment, you can only really do that symptomatically. So there are symptoms of TBI that aren't necessarily common to psychiatric disorders: sensitivity to light, sensitivity to noise, headaches, and so on. So there is if you combine history, blast exposure, and even that's hard to measure, right? Because it's all about the patient looking backwards at their own blast exposure, and that's subjective. A lot of us are like, oh, it was nothing. It's a military thing, isn't it? To understate everything, to downplay everything. But to try and to ascertain a sort of history of blast exposure, obviously, and then you try and symptomatically, and that's at the moment, that's all they've got. So there's one guy I spoke to online who was referred to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist went, I think it's something else going on. He referred them to a neurologist, who then scanned them. And although the scan's not a diagnostic, because then NICE haven't approved it, it's a useful tool, right? And diagnose them with TBI. One person that I've spoken to, I think what happens normally is not that. I think what happens normally is that people present and end up with a diagnosis of PTSD that doesn't respond to treatment in the way that it should, because PTSD is treatable largely. And then it's CPTSD, and then they're like, well, you're too complex we can't help you, you're too complex.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what's the scale of this, right? What's the spectrum of it? Because the people we speak to, that we meet, that we talk to, tend to be at the far end, because it's so little known. You have to be right on that end of the spectrum for it to be, well, this must be TBI, right? But is there a sort of spectrum of symptoms? Concentration, balance, memory, short-term memory loss. Could you just have a little bit of those things and be done? Probably seems likely.
Yeah.
Are there thousands of people affected by blast overpressure? Tens of thousands? Is that possible? We don't know. Is it possible? Yeah, it is possible. I mean, we don't know, but it's got to be possible, right? So yeah, that is as a piece of journalism, that's fascinating, and B, as a kind of public interest, from a public interest point of view, these are men and women whose damage directly relates to their service, right? And are not being that's something that every government claims that, everyone likes to wrap themselves in veterans welfare, politically speaking, right? Every party, and in fairness, various governments have done good things for that, including this one. So it's not just words. But here's a problem that it seems to me more needs to be done on. And as a journalist, that's something that, you know, that's a duty. Let's bang the drum. Let's see what we can see where we can put pressure on here to affect change in a positive way, because it's not just about the really interesting thing as well. Not interesting, but again, one of those penny drop things was people suffering from this without having been deployed operationally even. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the guy in Maine, Robert Card. He's shot. It was one of the sort of many spree killings in America that have become so kind of almost normalized that we kind of don't remember one from the other, which is horrific. But this guy shot, I don't recall, 16 or 18 people dead, injured another large number of people. He was in the National Guard, the sort of, you know, the reserves, for many years, 20 years or something. Never deployed, never went to Iraq, never went to Afghanistan, never had an operational tour. But he was a grenade instructor, and that was his job with his local National Guard. So he was on the grenade range day in, day out, subject to repeated low-level blasts over a very long period of time. So when the campaigners on this in the States heard about that, they requested that his brain be submitted for autopsy. So his brain went to the experts at Boston, and guess what? Serious brain damage, physical brain damage. Never deployed. So that's A, fascinating, but B, worrying. So is there a whole, not only is there an issue with suicide, the answer is almost certainly yes, right? There's also an issue here with the criminal justice system. And, you know, I know you've spoken in the past about, you know, veterans in the criminal justice system, the problems with that. What, are we looking at that as well, potentially? And again, the answer is probably going to be yes, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. One of the common things with that's been spoken about with regards to CTE, with regards to TBI on the US side, and different things I listen to over there, is the link between a high level athletes who are in contact sports and exhibit extremely erratic behavior, you know, similar to that which we see with PTSD victims. Now, Mark Gordon will say, if you speak to, have you spoken to Mark?
No.
I'll link you up with him if you want. He's like, and he loves talking. And he's a brilliant source of information, right? You know, cutting edge stuff on this subject. Mark Gordon will say to you that there is no such thing as PTSD. That's what you're saying. That's but hear me out. So what he will say is, so you know, we use PTSD as we would say, oh, he's got PTSD or she's got PTSD, that, and we say that as the illness. Now, what Mark's point is, he would say that there is no such thing as PTSD, as that's the illness. And what he means by that is, this is my interpretation of it, is that, and how this is what I think now as well, right? So when I hear someone's got PTSD, immediately what I think is, okay, I view that term as that is a description of a common set of symptoms, one or more from a bank of these symptoms, right? And also the cause of those symptoms, the mechanism of injury and the cause of the symptoms. I don't think PTSD is an illness per se. I think there's a good description of common symptoms, so what the mechanism of injury is.
I think there's two separate things there, right? And I'm not an expert, and sorry to cut across you there. I think it's two separate questions. One is, is there such a thing as PTSD independent of physical damage? I think the answer to that has to be yes, that there is. And I've spoken to quite a few people about that, because there's some science to that, right?
Yeah.
That does suggest that the two are so inextricably linked that one doesn't exist without the other, or some suggestions of that.
So that what are intrinsic?
PTSD and physical damage. But we have PTSD is common in survivors of domestic violence, in survivors of sexual assault and violence, and so on, in circumstances where there's no actual physical damage.
But the cause of that, though, Paul, the cause of that is not psychological. It's a neurophysiological cause. It's a neuroendocrinological issue. Okay. And again, this is from Mark Gordon and other people's research on it.
That's an area I'm not familiar with.
So let me just explain it. Let me just explain for you for 1 second. Then I thought we probably did speak about this before, but maybe I didn't. So there's a great documentary called, I think it's called Quiet Explosions. I think it's called, made in America, right? And it's all about TBI. Now, I don't know where you can get it. I think it's on Vimeo. I highly recommend anyone can go and get it. And if he has to pay for it, pay for it. I strongly suggest if you've got an interest in this. Long story short, in the documentary, it covers maybe 5 or 6 different subjects who are suffering from PTSD-like symptoms, or PTSD, right? Or, I mean, there's a couple on there who are American football players. They're suffering from symptoms. If they were soldiers or sailors or airmen, you'd call it PTSD,
Yeah.
right? But they're not, so it doesn't get called PTSD. So 5 or 6 of them. Now, most of them have had head trauma or been around weapons, shooting, whatever. Okay, you go, okay, it makes sense. These are TBIs that may be mislabeled as PTSD. I get it. Apart from the football player, which is obviously repeated concussion to the head. One of the people on there is a U.S. Navy, a female U.S. Navy. Never been around prolonged exposure to weapons. Like the last time she used weapons was when she was in training. The role she was in the Navy, never had to touch them. Was never on any artillery, on ship, anything like this. Nothing. Never repeated blows to the head. Her symptoms are exactly the same, and her neurophysiological condition is exactly the same as the others who have been exposed physically.
Yeah,
exactly the same. And the reason I say about someone who gets PTSD from a near-death experience, for example, or a rape or something like this, where there's no head trauma, is because the brain goes into the fight or flight mode. It has and these people, it has an extreme reaction, which is a normal reaction, fight or flight. All the hormones kick in that go, you need to survive here. But the changes don't. So normally what will happen is you get out of that life-threatening situation, you deal with it emotionally, and then your neuroendocrinological system resets itself back to normal.
Yeah.
In the US Navy lady, for example, in her case, it doesn't, right? The neuroendocrinological system stays in the state that is in the same state as what the people who had the physical interaction. It's the same thing. So where I'm saying it's not not PTSD, it's not psychological. It is a physiological created condition which manifests itself as a
no, I get what you're saying.
Visibly,
I mean, that's beyond my knowledge. That's not something I've come across, and obviously I think I've spoken to 7 or 8.
I am also not an expert.
Leading neurologists in this, six actually neurologists who are in this field, and it's quite a small world.
Yeah.
TBI research is not there's not like millions of medics who are into this sort of things in this space. So that's not something I've come across or investigated. It's not something I have any knowledge of, but I think that there is the other interesting thing is whether TBI can be a cause of PTSD. I know Mandy feels that very strongly that it is a cause of PTSD.
I think it's the primary cause.
And I think that's again, that's not there's scientific studies that suggest that. I don't think it's by any means broadly accepted amongst people in that space, but is it possible? I think it's possible. I don't think you can, at this stage with the knowledge we have, I don't think you can rule it out. I think it's a possible cause of PTSD. I think you can say that is something that is
I need to connect you
possible. But my view is, like, as a journalist, right, I'm going with, there's a danger, right, that you get that kind of, do they call it confirmation bias, or where if you look hard enough for something you find it everywhere. There's a danger if you get wrapped up too closely in a sort of subject, you frame everything around that subject, and you're in danger of going beyond what the science allows you to do. And I'm really conscious that the things that are kind of agreed on by the leading scientists here, that there is consensus on, are so shocking anyway that there's enough to deal with that alone.
Yeah,
but you're absolutely right. There are possibilities beyond that, right? There are possibilities beyond that. There's no question. But I'm not going there because I'm already.
What
My
do you mean?
focus.
What do you mean?
So in terms of things that are not scientific, so scientifically there is no dispute about certain things. There is no dispute that blast over pressure over a certain psi causes brain damage, right? Everyone's agreed on that. Everyone's agreed that repetitive blast exposure over a certain psi, that i.e. that form of damage can have an effect cumulatively over time that causes serious neurological effects, right? The type of damage, the symptoms are broadly agreed on. So it's agreed that sort of major concussions, particularly when they're repeated, can cause long-term neurological effects. So there's all these sorts of things that are, there's no real dispute over these things. So that's kind of where I'm happy, because all the leading neurologists agree with these things. Even the Ministry of Defence, they don't say no, this isn't true. They dispute the scale of it, or they question the scale of it. They say, well, we don't know, we're investigating.
One of the interesting things.
But moving into stuff like whether TBI causes PTSD, there are some scientific studies that suggest that's possible, but it's by no means is it consensus. I mean, it's not a consensus.
Okay, so a question on this.
The other point you made as well is that's not generally accepted. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but again, we were talking about mainstream media, in your words, right, and being responsible and so on. Well, that's I'm taking a very conservative, small C view about what we look at and what we report. But that doesn't mean the other things are wrong. It just means that
so what are the
I'm trying to
just a question in
stick
your
with
research.
the scientific kind of
question in your
consensus.
research. So from what you research, what are the common symptoms, psychological symptoms of TBI?
Well, there's some kind of some quite good stuff. There's some graphics on this. I don't
want like the whole list, but just.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'd struggle to do the whole list, to be honest. But as I understand it, there are sort of symptoms that are common to PTSD.
TBI, I'm talking about.
Yeah, there are symptoms that overlap. There are symptoms that are more associated with TBI than with PTSD. Examples would be sensitivity to light and noise, dizziness, short-term memory loss, headaches, migraine type headaches. Those are sorts of symptoms where you would think, you might think red flag, TBI here, if you were a medic, as far as I understand it. Then there are things that are specific to PTSD, like flashbacks. You don't, from TBI, you don't get flashbacks if TBI is your only problem, for instance. That immediate sense of being somewhere else, or being in a place that's dangerous. And so on.
The thing is with the flashbacks, and PTSD, right, is that people think flashbacks are common to PTSD. Flashbacks are they're not a common thing amongst people who suffer from PTSD. They're just an obvious one that people are.
But it's just, all of these things, right, are a spectrum. You can have one symptom and not the other. You can have a constellation of these. There's a complex kind of constellation, if you like, of different symptoms, some of which are, commonly associated with TBI in civilians or in other spheres of life, some of which are more. So it's not a kind of simple checklist of like tick, 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 or you've only got one of those, therefore you're not afflicted. It's not that simple. I mean, even the sort of leading neurologists we interviewed, a sort of professor of neurology and experimental neuropathology at Oxford, which is a fantastic job title. A guy called Gabriel De Luca. We interviewed him for one of our reports on this, and he really stressed that this is incredibly complex, and that the thing he said that sort of stuck with me as a kind of really good explanation is that we've got into this way of looking at the world where you have the mind, the conscious mind, and the brain, and we separate them as if they're two different things.
And then the body.
And of course,
separate.
Everything that goes on is a series of electrical impulses through the brain. That is your mind. So I think it's not right to separate them. We need to think of them more holistically. And that neurologists, neuropathologists, psychiatrists, neuropsychiatrists need to be joining up on this, because all of them have expertise in a particular sphere, and that the way through this is for all these disciplines to kind of work more closely together.
Yeah,
so I thought that was really interesting. Sorry, one other thing that the same guy said to me, that it was another is this analogy with smoking, that we know it does you harm, but it's cumulatively over time. You don't have a cigarette when you're 12 at school or whatever and then die from it. You bit by bit by bit by bit. Suddenly, when you're 50, you get stroke, heart attack, lung cancer diagnosis, or whatever it is. And similarly with smoking, we didn't know everything about it before we acted. Right, we banned smoking, we banned cigarette sales to children long before we knew what exactly what all the pathological links were between smoking and lung cancer, for instance. What we knew was there was a huge statistical association between smokers and health problems in later life. We knew that. What we didn't know is exactly how cigarettes cause this type of cancer, right? But we didn't need to know every single thing about it to act. We acted and we banned smoking. And since then, we've done more and more and more to marginalise smoking and so on, right? But the same thing, it seems to me, applies here, right? We don't know everything about this. There's a lot we don't know about it. But what we do know is it exists. We do know it's a problem. We do know it's almost certain to be at some scale. So my question as a journalist would be, why aren't we acting?
Why aren't we acting?
Why aren't we doing
I mean,
things?
I
mean, specific things like, for instance, NICE urgently looking at brain scans as a diagnostic tool, like GPs referring to Royal College of GPs, making sure that TBI is something that GPs know about. Those sorts of things, awareness things, they don't cost anything.
No, they don't. I agree. I mean, the thing is, the subject can be complex, but I think where it comes to coming back to the treatment or identification of the cause of of someone being mentally mentally compromised in whatever way. We're going to again, let's use the PTSD example, or someone presents with obvious symptoms that look like this PTSD. Right now, yes, psychology is complicated. Yes, it's difficult to get to the root cause analysis or the root cause of things. But the argument, the suggestion, and the frustration from Mark and from both Mandy and many other people now is that their frustration is that it is a no-brainer, no pun intended. It's no brainer. It is patently obvious to them, and I think, and to me, after speaking to them, obviously, so I'm in that echo chamber, that if someone presents with a psychological issue, depression, anxiety, whatever, that the first thing that should be done, apart from immediate care and if these people are suicidal, remember the first thing, one of the very first things should be done, is to test their neuroendocrinological level, their brain hormones, to see where those are at. You test those, you measure them against the common baseline across the population. We have that baseline. You have a baseline of what it should be. And there's fluctuations in different people, different hormones, what it should be, what the baseline is. But generally we know what the range each hormone should be in. You test those, you see where the deficiencies lie, and let's say one or two areas need to be increased or decreased. Then you try and then through treatment, and this supplementation is one way of doing it. Literally taking medication on a daily basis, natural medication, which non-harmful, should we say, very few side effects to get your hormones back to a baseline the way they should be. You take those, you get the hormones to where they should be as close as you can, as best you can, and then you see what psychological symptoms remain, and then you treat the psychological symptoms. Because the assumption is based on their research and experience with treating veterans here in the UK and in the USA is that when you treat the hormones first, the neuroendocrinological system first, it reduces the psychological symptoms. Absolutely does it. Now, what's interesting, just two seconds, sorry. What's also interesting about this is that, and when you speak to Mark, he will, I think I mentioned it to you as well. What's interesting about this is when you accept that to be the case, and if you believe this to be the case based on the evidence, it means not only can you put in more effective treatment for people suffering from PTSD, okay, life-changing treatment, which is relatively cheap and relatively quick. You can also put in protocols within the military, which Mark Gordon is doing now. I know he's doing it informally with people on the Welsh border, special forces in that area of the world, and he's also doing it with special forces units in the USA. You can preemptively supplement, so literally adjust your diet, take on additional supplementation to bolster the hormones in the brain that they know are most commonly affected by blast, by repeated exposure to blast. And in doing so, even when you're a special forces or any soldier, sailor, airman who's going to go into battle or even just training, whatever, and you shoot, going to be in these environments, it goes the same for sports. So contact sports, American football players, rugby players, boxing, you can basically up armor the brain to be less likely to be subject to a TBI from what you're doing, or at the very minimum, less likely to have real bad symptoms from a TBI you may or may not get anyway. You can literally supplement to protect yourself, which should be so. And I know you said the MOD are looking into this. I'd be interested to see exactly how they're looking into it, because they're probably worried about. They have to be worried about, lawsuits and things like this. Look at the hearing probably got in a minute. But
well, one of the big things that they're doing in the States as well as the UK is looking for biomarkers as a diagnostic.
Yeah.
So large numbers of diseases or dysfunctions or whatever create reactions which are measurable in the body, chemicals or whatever. So is it possible that blast TBI could create unique biomarkers that can be measured, or can be, with a blood test or a urine test or whatever it might be? So something cheap, simple, something that can be scaled up very quickly, and something that's portable that can be taken out into Afghanistan or, wherever it's needed. So that's an area of research. In terms of hormones and the neuroendocrine system, it's quite complex. There's a lot of what I've read, as far as I've read, which is, I'll go back to, I'm not an expert. I just ask the questions, and I've read fairly widely on this. I'm trying to do a piece on it. It's a slightly mixed picture, in as much as it's almost certain that there is a connection between blast. It's almost certain that there is some connection between pituitary dysfunction, the pituitary gland, which sort of regulates hormones, and blast. That there is a relationship there, but it's not universally accepted that. So some of the science in the United States, which is fascinating, suggesting that 40% of combat infantrymen, for instance, have lowered testosterone, for instance. Testosterone and growth hormone are the two main ones that they seem to crop up in the literature.
I didn't know about the growth hormone. Okay.
Yeah, that seems to be, just from my reading the literature. I'm totally not. I go back to it. I'm like, scrape through my O's and A's, and that's me. So, but just from sort of trying to get across the science that's coming out of the States. Now that's disputed, because measuring hormones, I know this as somebody who had a pituitary tumor, so I'm reasonably I'm familiar from the kind of what's it called, the user end of with endocrinology, rather than the science, if you like, is that they measure it. They like to measure your levels repeatedly over a period of time, over quite a long period of time. Where the science snapshots a population and says this is true, that's not considered brilliant science, because you're not following it up over a period of time.
No, it's not ideal.
And the other thing is that there's a kind of series of tests that they like to do. Not all the science in the States has done. It's not as rigorous as perhaps it might be. If you really wanted to, if you were funded to end-to-end research this, because a lot of the point about research that we don't really consider, right, as non-scientists, is that if your funding is X, right, your research will allow you to do Y, because that's what you're funded for.
Yeah.
And if your funding is like much bigger, you can do much more. So, for instance, there's the advanced study that's happening at the moment in the UK, which is looking at a whole series of long-term health outcomes from people who've been caught up in IEDs and such like. It's potentially really interesting in terms of TBI, right? We don't know what their conclusions are yet. But what I'm told, and I don't know this 100%, but I believe from having read their, what they put online and what I'm told, is they're not specifically looking at hormones, at testosterone and growth hormone, about the pituitary, the neuroendocrine system. that seems to be like a massively wasted opportunity, right? Because this is fairly thorough, fairly well researched cohort study over a long period of time. So it's, in terms of science, it's good science. So, it would be a shame if it were doing that. That would help to answer all of these questions, right? This study doesn't appear, as far as I could see, the study isn't doing that, and I think that's a real shame. And that's and that's presumably because it's not funded to do that.
Part of the problem,
But I do think that some of the sort of headlines about the neuroendocrine stuff don't bear an awful lot of scrutiny. That's not to say that what you're talking about is not true. That's totally not what I'm saying. It's not to say that there's not a relationship between blast, between TBI, and between neuroendocrine problems. I'm pretty sure there is, but I think it's complex, and I think I'm just speaking as a journalist. In terms of what I would report, it's difficult.
yeah, one of
There's
the
a sort of, there are things that everyone agrees on, and there's an awful lot that everyone doesn't.
yeah, but what the problem is on this topic, right? I brain's complex, science is complex, but what I don't agree with is how overcomplicated the is being made out uh, about the protocol of treat the hormones first, see what remains after. That's not a complicated situation because we know the range should be. So ideally, like you were saying, ideally we would know an individual's
But
baseline of
but
hormone levels
I think
beforehand,
there are
right?
some issues. Again, I'll be corrected by I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, because I'm a layman here. But I think if you treat, for instance, if you take testosterone supplements, your brain adjusts to having those supplements, and therefore it doesn't produce. So for instance, I had very low testosterone as a result of a
Yeah, no.
pituitary
So
tumor, and very low, and it was monitored over a period of time. And my endocrinologist, who was excellent, was like, look, we can give we can kind of help in terms of short term, right? We can give you testosterone supplements. The danger with that is that your brain then adjusts what's required to
so
that,
that
and then you're
is
stuck with that flow. And
that is not so from Mark's so, so from Mark's side that is not the protocol. So it is not so during that supplementation I'm talking about, it is not giving you the
I
hormones.
see, right?
Yeah, it's not. This
It's
is what I meant
diet
by
and
natural is
yeah,
it
right.
takes
Okay,
weeks.
understood.
I think it takes because
Understood.
I did a program of his with the supplements, and if I recall, it was 3 weeks. I think it was. You take them on a daily basis, and over that 3 weeks, it basically is triggering your body to gradually
Right, understood. Yeah, I
itself produce the hormones it should be producing.
got
Right
you.
now, going back to the point I wanted to make just now. One of the problems with this area of research and this proposition that hey, actually TBI, TBIs may be the real cause of what PTSD is, and we should be treating it a different way, or we should be assessing people in a different way. We should be monitoring this in a different way. One of the main problems with this is the massive resistance against people like Mandy, people like Mark, and people like you've spoken to on the subject from places like Imperial, places which are heavily invested in psychiatry and
You know what?
psychology.
I think that's changing now. I think that's changing because I think it's changing
It's
slowly.
definitely changed since I spoke to
I
Mandy,
th-
but not the way it should be going.
I think
And
I
Mandy,
think
sorry for people listening, I spoke to Mandy in 2018 or 2019. That's how long ago that interview was. Yeah,
episode 99.
episode 99. Yeah,
Um, it
I must
seems
listen.
to me that so science can move slowly. We know we can move very slow. So if you look at, there are incredible breakthroughs that you'll read about in the newspaper in terms of, let's say, CAR T therapy for
Yeah.
stem cell engineering and so on, right? You go to the hospital and they're, no, this is a trial for the next 6 years, and then it has to be approved, and then it's not going to be mainstream medicine for a long time. So medicine generally moves slowly, science moves slowly. It can move an awful lot more quickly, as we found out during COVID, if the funding's there. So there is a kind of question about how much money is going into this. Is it enough? Other scientists getting all the support they need to answer these questions, and so on and so forth. But I think we're kind of in the modern age of needing everything to be instant. I think we sometimes get frustrated with how slowly these things work, and sometimes we're right to be frustrated with how with how these things go. But sometimes there are genuine intractables, genuine problems, genuine disagreements in the scientific community about what should be done. So there is that. I also think, nobody's saying no, this isn't true. I think 10 years ago people would have scoffed at this, and I'm sure Mandy suffered from that, right? And I'm sure the other people you reference have suffered from that, and maybe still do to some extent. But nobody's saying this isn't the case. There is an agreement between the leading neurologists in this field that this exists, that this is a problem, and so that's a huge leap in terms of nobody's saying it doesn't exist. Nobody's saying it's not a problem. Where there are arguments about the scale. So in the US they appear to have a problem this big, and in the UK it appears to be that big, and yet our armies are the same. We're doctrinally very similar. Our weapon systems are very similar. There's very few fundamental differences between the US and the UK in terms of blast exposure. You can argue, and it is argued, and I've seen it argued, that US tours of Iraq and Afghanistan were longer, and therefore there's more intense blast exposure over a particular measurable time. But I'm not sure how much that stands up. You might get US servicemen within 8 people, might do 1 tour. UK servicemen might do 4 tours. I'm not sure how robust that is. And the other point is that it's not taking into account training. So if you're a mortar operator and you're firing 81mm mortars, 120mm mortars, it kind of doesn't matter if you're in Afghanistan or if you're in Iowa or if you're in Sennybridge. Right? The blast exposure is the same. So you might be putting more rounds down the range in a combat situation in Afghanistan, true, because there are less restrictions on money and training budgets and so on. But you can go through an awful lot of ammo in training, as I know, because I did. So yeah, those arguments are there. But about sort of scale, about how big a problem it is, and about something wanting a kind of perfect diagnostic system, and that's kind of what we hope the MOD are working towards, and we hope that's happening at pace. So I don't think there's like a resistance in that, but if you're having an appalling time in your life, and some of the people who are afflicted with this really are, and if that is directly attributable to your service, and I think that's pretty much demonstrable, right, in a lot of these cases. If you've had TBI, you've been exposed to blast, if the pattern of damage, once we get to the point of you have been able to say this isn't rugby, right, which we're not at yet, but once we get there, and I think it will happen, then of course, right, yes, there is a possibility of legal action that follows that, and that's does that inform thinking in the MOD? Probably, I don't know. Yeah, I hope it doesn't inform. But we were talking about journalists earlier on, and the guys in the top office, and what I do. I hope it doesn't inform their scientists. I'm pretty sure it doesn't. I think most people are on. That's not going to be top of their mind. But is there somebody in the MOD going, "Oh my God, if this is true, it's going to cost us billions. Where's that money going to come from?" Yeah, maybe, possible, isn't it?
Yeah, I gotta say it's likely.
But I mean, that's not that won't stop the science, right? That's not going to stop the science evolving. That's not going to stop these incredibly dedicated, incredibly intelligent, incredibly motivated guys that I've been speaking to with expertise in neuroimaging, neuropathology, neurology. This is their life. This is what they do. And they're incredibly, incredibly good at it. The science is going to carry on. So,
yeah, but what it does do is it slows down progress. Yeah, right? Now, if the
totally.
MOD were,
that's the danger, yeah.
If the MOD were playing a long game and a sensible game here, right? I would suggest that they would have done the mathematics, done the calculations. I don't mean actual calculations. I mean, done the logic and gone, it's highly probable that this is going to be, we're going to be opened up here to a bunch of cases of, money, compensation claims, like exactly what we're seeing now with hearing claims, which are going back 20 odd years. You can go back and claim on this stuff. That they're looking at that in the face now. I'd say they think there's probably a reality. They don't know the scale of it, but the longer it drags on, the worse that probably become for them. Right now, the earlier they can push to a resolution on what exactly the cause is and how they can prevent things, the earlier they can put protocols in place to lessen the financial burden on them in the future for the soldiers, sailors, airmen and women of today who could be getting impacted, who are literally joining up today, right?
Well, so I don't know.
And on that, the longer it drags on, the longer people have who are out of the military have an absolute miserable time,
Yeah,
and the more people
that's important.
unnecessarily top themselves
Right.
and could be.
Totally. That's a really important point. I think so. Firstly, it's not my job to guess what the MOD think. You know, what the MOD say to me is what I report, or what the, you know, and I don't want to have an oppositional relationship with the MOD based on me conjecturing what might be happening in the corridors of power. That's just not how responsible journalism works, right?
Yeah.
They put their position, we report their position. That's that. So I've no idea. They might be working at this at pace as hard as they possibly can. Blah blah blah. The lawsuit might be the furthest thing from their mind, for all I know. I don't know, it doesn't. It's not necessarily helpful to speculate. What what you can make as a valid comparison is what's happening in the United States. I don't know if you saw the 60 Minutes recently with a guy called Larkin, who was a like unbelievable military CV. He was Navy SEAL and then CIA and then everything else, and um, it was involved in Washington as a very senior sort of security guy. His son became a Navy SEAL, was afflicted with TBI, blast TBI, and took his own life.
Oh, shit.
And he did this amazing interview, incredibly powerful interview with 60 Minutes. And he's been speaking to, obviously, because of the contacts he has, the connection he has, and the kind of respect in which he is held, has sort of helped make changes in the sort of, you know, special forces community there, certainly the Navy SEALs, where they are looking at how many rounds you can fire from particular weapon systems without time to recover between them, where they're, you know, measuring blast. So they're making practical measures to reduce blast exposure for a proportion of US forces. Come back to this thing about smoking, right? We may not know everything about it, but if we accept that blast causes damage, repeated exposure to blast can potentially cause, you know, then why not take those? Why not take those measures? You know,
Yeah.
why not take this measure? They could be temporary measures. If we find out that there's a cure, or that there's a new helmet design, or that there's a
Yeah.
thing, you know, if we find out there's a door we can walk through that makes this, that solves this simply, well, then, you know, go back to firing sort of 15 84mm anti-tank weapons in a day, or however many 120mm mortar rounds you want to bang out. But in the meantime, does it not make sense to put those restrictions in place? And the Americans are working towards that, not as quickly as some people feel they should be, but that is at least tangible, something that's happening. Could that happen in the UK? I don't see why not, but that's a question for the MOD. We will ask them. But at least, but there is something practical happening, and I think it's difficult if you're in like an alliance like NATO, like the Five Eyes and all that kind of stuff. If one partner is doing something quite radical like that, the others will, you know, journalists in Australia are sort of saying, well, what are we doing? Journalists in Canada, well, what about you guys? And that's happening. You know, that is happening.
Yeah.
Um,
The other thing that the MOD, I mean, I think if they've got any ounce of sense about them, or real intent to get to this, to get to a not a resolution, but progress this as fast as practically possible. You know, I suggest that is immediately starting to monitor a percentage of people who are joining up now. I say monitor, as in assess.
yeah,
They
baseline,
join you exactly. You
baseline, yeah.
baseline those. You baseline the brain. You baseline the hormone levels and whatever else I think is necessary to do. You baseline those, and you take snapshots throughout. You know, you check, either after certain incidents, certain types of training, certain events on tour, and you know, periodically every 6 months, every year, or whatever. You know, and you do that because they will thing is, they will decide to do that at some point. That's an obvious step to take. That will happen at some point, right? Why it doesn't start happening now, it is beyond me. It's just a total, you know, it's anyway, I find it I find it very frustrating, but you know, one of the things that you're highlighting with your research that you're doing on it and the story you're doing on it is is how far forward we've come, even just since 2018, since I interviewed Mandy, to where we are now. You know, the fact that you and your organization are doing this is a really big thing. It's a really positive step. You know, so I'm going to try and chill out.
Yeah, look,
On
it's
it.
a responsibility for us. From my point of view, it's what we're for, right? It's what we exist to do. You know, it's public interest journalism. It just is. And the frustration for me is we can't go quicker, we can't do more. that everything takes time, and there are very good reasons for that, people's availability and so on and so forth. So there's interviews that we'd like to do that where people don't want to talk to us, and that's like
Yeah.
that's how the world works. And so, for instance, I've spoken to a number of families of people who've lost loved ones to suicide, and that's really difficult, right? Because in some cases they've campaigned about mental health. Where do you even start with sort of putting something else onto the table there 5 years afterwards, 10 years after? Is it even fair to do that? Is it even ethical to sit down with the mother of somebody who died by suicide and to suggest that maybe something else was at play there that nobody even mentioned to you before? Is that
It's the harsh
that's not
reality.
easy to do. So we've gone a bit of a way down that path, but it's really awkward, and it's really there are lines beyond which and so everyone needs time to. We present the topic as something that may, if it's not interesting to you, don't do it, and so
Yeah.
on. And people tend to have a discussion with every family members and decide that what, we don't want to get involved with this. It's not something we want. And the burden of sharing something so horrific, right, in public to millions of people is tough.
Yeah.
Would I do that? Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. Is what would I do if my son, God forbid, my daughter, God forbid? I don't think I'd leave the house. You know what I mean? So you have to be patient. There is one family who have spoken to us and are fantastic, and their courage is like,
Mm.
very moving. And we will broadcast that piece as soon as it's ready. But it's can't happen quickly. Everything takes time. So we are working on it. We're committed to it. I'm committed to it personally. It's a fascinating, apart from anything else, just intellectually, it's fascinating.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, and like you say, people are suffering. So and more. So there are people who are suffering who I think what they've got is what they've got, right? But there's that knowing you're not alone, knowing this isn't just me, knowing what you're dealing with, I think is really important. So there's a guy we've spoken to. I'm not going to go into too much detail because we haven't broadcast this yet. And I've mentioned this to Kate as well before about like why do you want a diagnosis of why do you want to have a scan that might tell you you've got serious brain damage? I mean, is it not better to have PTSD as a diagnosis?
Yeah.
And it's that because it's like what you're seeking is appalling news, right? It's terrible news that you've then got to deal with. And the people we have asked that question to say, it's better to know. Whatever it is, it's better to know. Then you know what you're dealing with. And you can have, and this is true in civilian life, car crashes and whatever, you can have a meaningful positive. It's not like there's not grounds for despair. You can find there are a whole series of therapies that are interesting. Some work for some people. Not all of them are kind of mainstream licensed type of medicine, but there is a lot of things that some people find comfort from.
Yeah.
People have routines, have physical exercise, all this other stuff.
Just
So it's not the end of the world, that diagnosis, but it is important to people to know, is it just me? Is it my brain? Or is
yeah.
it physical damage?
And for 99.9% of people, knowing and understanding what the condition is, even if you can't change that, is a method of relief in itself.
Seems that way, yeah.
Method of relief in itself for sure.
Seems that way. The other thing is, one other quick thing is like, I'm slightly going sort of totally off piste here, but they have this sort of memorial wall. It's one of the families said to me, there's up at the Arboretum in.
Yeah. Are you going to say there's nothing there for suicide?
Yeah, and if you die by suicide, and I kind of understand why that is. I get the sort of reasons for all that. But if your suicide is a direct line from a physical injury sustained as a result of your service, is that not a totally different
I
conversation
mean,
that needs to be had?
you could say that, but then the argument from the opposite side of the people who put the names on the wall is, oh, can you prove that? Prove it. I
But
understand. I get
but
it.
I mean, but I
I
think that's kind of where we're going, isn't it? I think we will be able to prove that. Oh, sorry, but how does
that's
this
a
work?
crate, isn't it? That's a crate. Look at that.
How do we do this? You
Go and grab
just
it. Go and
press
grab it.
pause.
Yeah, go and grab it. Right. I'm gonna.
Sorry, that's the.
Do you need to answer it?
That's what we in broadcasting call schoolboy error.
Yeah, you're the professional.
I know, it's appalling. I apologise humbly.
No, I know exactly your point. There's at least one family that I know of one of my friends who sadly took his own life, and I don't know if there's any other said with it. That one family that's sticking in my mind. His mum said the same thing. You know, there's nowhere. Where can I go? Where's he represented? You know, and
I'm not attaching myself to either side in an argument, but it's
the
an
answer
argument,
is don't
right?
have the suicides.
It's a serious discussion. You know, these
Yeah,
people have
yeah.
given everything, and
I believe
you
there
know,
is a monument now somewhere. They're not. They're not
is
on the
there?
wall, but I think there is a suicide monument. Which fuck the fact that we have to have that is just, you know. I mean, well, I'm not going to look for it. I was going to look for it online there, but there should be a place in the arboretum.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Maybe the name doesn't go on the wall. I don't know. Whatever. Sorry, I mean whatever flippantly. I mean I don't know. But at the very least, I think there should be a place in the arboretum for these people. You know, a service person. You know, who takes their own life. Uh, yeah. But right,
Can I make a blatant plug? Is that if you're
we haven't finished yet.
watching this, I know, but it seemed like a good time to get it
Oh, go
in
for it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of
after
course.
I interrupted us with my cunning phone call. It's just that if this is something you have knowledge of, interest in, genuine experience of, something you want to say, get in touch with me because I'm interested. And that may not be something I can help with. It may not be something that translates to anything practical, but the more people I speak to, there is a capacity issue a bit. I try and do bits in, in chunks as and when I can, but the more people I speak to, the better. So if you're a kind of subscriber to Hugh, get in touch with Hugh. You can get in touch with me, or
Whoa. What's your email address?
get really simple, paul.tyson@itn.co.uk, or go to itv.com/news, Google TBI. My pieces will come up. My name's on there, my email's on there, and there's a website specifically for this, which is investigations@itn.co.uk. So you can get in touch with me a number of ways. I'm on Twitter.
Investigations. What?
Investigations@itn.co.uk.
Oh, that's the email address. Right. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, or my name. The problem with our email system is it's incredibly kind of secure, so lots of stuff goes to junk, clutter, quarantine, or whatever. So the investigations one nothing gets quarantined. It comes straight to me, so it's probably better than my personal one.
Okay.
So nothing will get missed. Or get in touch with me, whatever, Twitter, Facebook, however you like. But this is a sort of growing, building, evolving sort of thing as a piece of journalism, and the more voices, the more I hear, the more I learn, and the more capacity we have to sort of fight this battle.
Yeah.
Anyway,
okay. Right, we've got a bunch of questions left over from the icebreaker, and also new ones that were going into the live stream as we were talking. So we're going to get through those now, if that's all right. All right. If you could only report on one area for the rest of your career, what would it be?
Climate change. So what's happened with climate change is it's become politicized. I'm not sure when that happened, and I'm certainly not sure why that happened, but it became a kind of, we went from sort of, a body of political opinion that didn't believe in climate change at all, didn't believe it existed. Then as the science became incontrovertible, people believed it existed but didn't believe it was man-made. Then that argument moved to, so now where we are is the argument is, yeah, it does exist. Yes, we accept it is man-made, but we can't really do anything about it, or we shouldn't do anything about it because it will cost too much or make us uncompetitive. So there's this kind of interesting shift. And there was a time when all the main parties were aligned on that, where the Conservatives, Labour, Liberals, all, broadly speaking, agreed with each other that this was a major crisis that we needed to do more on. And now that time seems to have gone. It seems to have become kind of a left-right political issue, which is nonsense. It's not. It's physics. It's just science. It's just there's nothing political about it, really. Or there shouldn't be. This is something where we should all be able to work together and to find solutions. And it's just fascinating. The science of it is fascinating. It takes you to some beautiful places, which is obviously irrelevant from a journalist's point of view. But personally speaking, it's lovely to go trekking on glaciers and so on, and it affects all of us, and it affects all of our kids more, and it affects our grandchildren more, and there's simply no doubt about that. It's probably the most important issue in the world today. So that if I could just do one thing thematically, it would be climate change.
Okay, biting my tongue. Right. Okay, so Coke in the chat when we were talking about blast traumatic injuries, he said, "You don't wear ear defenders when firing live weapons?" Question mark. So, well, what was your experience with wearing ear defense when you were serving? And I'll give mine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, just for
Give 'em-
people listening,
They either
Paul demonstrated you would just take them out your ears and throw them away.
they either fell out, which they did all the time, the little yellow things, right? Or you took them out because you needed to be able to communicate by voice with your section commander. I was a platoon commander in the infantry. You know, if I can't hear my section commander shouting and then me, then comms become very difficult.
There's been a big evolution of ear defense. So for
There
Coke's,
has, yeah, I know that, yeah.
for Coke's benefit and people listeners' benefit, there's been a big evolution in protective equipment for hearing in the military over, well, since you served, since I served, to now. In fact, so when I joined, it was the same as you. We would get issued like big over the ear, we call them amp blocks, over the ear, over the head earmuff type ear defenders, which when worn under a helmet were extremely uncomfortable. Were not usable in conjunction with the radio systems we had at the time. I'm assuming it was Klansman we were in. It was Klansman when I first joined. And also, to your point, it was very difficult to communicate to each other. So the amplivox you wouldn't have. Then they would issue as an alternative the yellow ear defense, little sponge things you put in your ears. They weren't great at preventing the kind of noise you get from weapon systems. They weren't bad, but it was the same problem. Not compatible with radio systems. You couldn't hear people. It was like you couldn't hear anything. You need to be able to communicate verbally when you're in the military, when there's loud noise going on. So those hearing protection wasn't good. So you would take them out. It wasn't that you take them out, and you had to take them out to be able to do your job. So they would get binned. So yeah, you'd fire weapons without hearing defense in, or you'd fire weapons with one hearing defense in one ear and not in the other ear. And then fast forward to, I'm trying to think when I got issued them, 2010, when I went out on the third, my final tour with 3 part, the third Afghan tour I did. That's when we finally got, our unit anyway, finally got what were known then as P-hips. You ever hear of P-hips?
I've heard of them, yeah. I've not seen them or used them, but I've heard of them.
And P-hips were, you get a mold done of your inner ear. That mold will go off, and then maybe 4 to 6 weeks later, you get sent back. A little plastic box. In there was a piece of plastic, soft plastic, basically an in-ear ear defender that was perfectly molded to the shape of your ear, but also had a removable like cap inside it, which you'd remove that and you could connect with an attachment. You could connect your radio to it, so it would keep out the blast, keep out the noise, but you could hear your radio through it. And also, as part of that radio system, had a microphone on there which would filter out the loud noise and filter. So you could basically be next to someone with your hearing defense in, you could talk and hear that, like AirPods these days. Like if you can hear someone talking but not loud noises, the same kind of thing. We got issued those 2010. But back when you and I joined, it was worse when you joined. There's just non-existent. You had to take them out. Everyone took them out, which actually in itself is demonstrative of how different people's bodies are and people's heads are and brains and ears are. That when I went through training and all those years when I was in before we got the P-hips and on those tours, most people I say didn't came without hearing injury. A big proportion did come away with a hearing injury, but most didn't. Everyone was experiencing the same thing.
I mean, I'm in my mid-50s and I've got hearing aids. No one in my family has hearing aids. My mother does. Really? She's in her 80s, but no, there's no family history. But I'm mid-50s and I've got hearing aids. So it's
okay. All right, so let's look through these questions. I'm not sure I understand this question. I'm going to skip past it. Okay. Which group of people tend to give unjustified negativity in comments? We're talking about in response to news here, such as left or right-leaning people. So are left-leaning people more likely to give negative comments, or right-leaning people?
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm tempted to say that.
You're going to say right because you're left.
No, not. Well, I'm not really. I don't regard myself that way. I think they're as bad as each other. I think it's the kind of the more sort of, the further you lean one way or the other, the more likely you are to to sort of have a worldview that is that journalists are here to lie to you and controlled by lizard men and such like. I don't think I don't notice. I might obviously somebody somewhere has done a research paper on this, right? I'm sure. But just from sort of personal experience point of view, I've not seen any different. In fact, weirdly, I think they're really quite often it's hard to tell which way somebody leans politically from they could be either equally from the comments you get. So it's quite sometimes it's not talking about their whole sort. It's not like I go and research people's worldviews online or anything. Do you know what I mean? But sometimes the sort of far left, if you're allowed to call them that, and the far right, if you're allowed to call them that, are so similar. Now, politics isn't like a straight line; it's more like a horseshoe sort of thing. That theory, and they're so sort of similar that it's actually hard to tell from people's comments where their political sort of leanings is. Sometimes it seems to me.
What is the worst hate you've received, and how did you feel about it?
I'm quite sort of thick-skinned. I don't really. I mean, people. I tend to think when people sort of react negatively to you, it's usually kind of understandable. I've been threatened where a new big news story, a bomb or whatever, and you're immediately reacting to that, and you're knocking on people's doors or whatever. People will tell you to in no uncertain terms to go away or whatever, and you vultures and all that sort of stuff. You kind of understand that though, don't you? That's a natural human sort of response. It's not personal, I never feel it personally. So I'll take it like when you're a journalist, you get shot at from time to time because you're working with you're working with the Free Syrian Army, or you're working with Assad's forces, or you're working with the Libyan Revolution, or whoever it is you're with, right? Occasionally you're going to get shot at or mortared and whatever that's going to happen. It's not personal to you. And I think I sort of take it the same way. It's not, I don't take it personally when people take those views. They have an opinion of what I am about and why I'm there, but it's not personal. I'm a kind of avatar for all journalists and in that circumstances. So I've never really been affected by it. There are certain topics I stay away from. I sort of I've been to Gaza, I don't know, 4 or 5 times. I'm not sort of going to expand on that particularly, but I tweeted about that once, and I was subjected to an enormous amount of online abuse.
What did you tweet?
We went
Was this recently?
No, a long time ago. I think it's 2014, and we went to a particular place, like a UN school that had been smashed up in I think it was in Rafah by a tank fire, and I was basically trying to find a firing point, and there wasn't one. And I tweeted what we saw with pictures and whatever, just because it was interesting. And suddenly I was kind of, an agent of Hamas and a radical Islamic jihadist,
terrorist.
and so and then I sort of said, well, look, all I'm doing is tweeting myself. I'm not drawing any conclusions from that. And then suddenly I was a Zionist kind of, settler. But I mean, it's like I can't be both. I mean, So there are some subjects that are just.
Well, the internet will make you both.
Well, no, that's kind of what happened. So, and there was an American, a kind of American, well-known American commentator. I won't say his name. But he was a well-respected kind of think tank type person who was calling me a coward because I wasn't reporting that Hamas were on every doorstep and controlling all our moves and controlling everything we did, and we weren't reporting it because it's not visible. It doesn't work like that. It's not it's not like they come and take you to. There are certain places you try to get to and they're like, no, you can't go there. Same as if you try and wander into Hereford, or as you wander, that's also true here, right? I'm not making that as making sort of excuses. They're an unpleasant organisation, nasty sort of terrorist organisation. Let's call it what it is. But this idea that we're mouthpieces, unwitting mouthpieces from their control, that was not the case. We could go where you like, talk to who you like within certain limitations, and I thought calling us cowards when at that time there was heavy bombing from the Israelis. I mean, nothing compared to what's happening at the moment, but we'd rush out in the cars and go to a particular place and quickly film and quickly rush back at danger of our own lives. And this guy in Washington, I mean, serious danger of our own lives, and this guy in Washington is calling me a coward. I thought that's a bit strong. So yeah, there are, you get into that, you can get into those sort of situations. But in terms of hate, I've never experienced something that I've regarded as personal to me, and that might be because I'm quite thick-skinned, but yeah, it's. I've not experienced that.
Okay. What is the hardest part of journalism? What roles in journalism are the most difficult?
Um, that's a very good question. That's a really good question that I'm not. It would take me a really long time to answer properly. It's subjective, right? So everyone would tell you something different. Um, you know, knowing stories are true and proving them, that's really frustrating. Knowing something's true, having one good source on something
How okay,
and
how can
needing
you
another.
know something is true but not be able to prove it?
Well, because if a friend of mine might tell me that something's true, but their knowledge might be secondhand. So I'm not. How can I get that through the lawyer? That
But in that case, you don't know it's true.
well, I'm sure it's true. Being sure, being certain that something is true.
Ah, that's different.
So, for instance, a friend of mine might have direct knowledge of something, but it's where's the paperwork? Where's the, you need the bar is reasonably high on stuff that's not mainstream, and it's
Yeah.
sometimes you just know this is happening, right? You know this is true. No, okay, I take your point, but you are certain that this is true, but there's just not enough to get it on air. That's really frustrating. Doesn't happen often, but I've had that a couple of times where I've essentially had to give up on stuff because the bar's too high,
Mm,
or my ability to get to the story is too low. Take it whichever way you like. That's frustrating. In terms of the hardest types of story to cover, earthquakes, wars are really easy.
okay.
War, if you
Earthquakes are the hardest type of story to
definitely,
cover.
and I've only done a couple. There's guys at my where I work who've done like I don't know 15 or whatever. There's guys who've done loads. So I don't want to big myself up here. I've only done a couple, but if you go to a war, you're plugged into one side or the other. Sometimes both. Weirdly, you can cross
Yeah.
the front line sometimes, but you're kind of an army needs to have food, right? Needs to have water, it needs to have power. There's certain things that any fighting force will have, and if you're a journalist and you're working with them, you just plug into all that, right? So logistics quite simple. Whereas if you go to an earthquake, like water is suddenly everyone needs water, and yeah, we do travel with money, and lots of people don't have money. But if you've got that amount of water for your kids and someone's offering you loads of dollars, the dollars don't look like they did a week ago anymore. They're not that, it's not that big a deal. If you've got to feed your kids and someone's offering
Mm,
you bits of paper, which for a week or two until normal order and aid starts to come and everything else is, that's all those dollars are. It's really difficult. So, all the normal stuff that you rely on isn't necessarily there. So the hotels that you might stay in, well, they might be affected. So where do you stay? Do you take the risk of aftershocks, structural damage, parts of the world that where building regulations might be iffy anyway? Do you take the risk and stay in a hotel? If you do, is it based on what architectural knowledge? Normally it's, well, yeah, there's a couple of cracks, but I think it'll be all right.
yeah.
We've got no idea.
Yeah.
Um, but or do you stay outside in tents and stuff? And obviously that degrades your ability to work. It separates you from, there's hygiene issues. It separates you from power supplies to charge all your kit. We have a phenomenal amount of kit that needs charging. And so food, everyone's after food. Everyone's after water, comms, all the mobile towers go down. So earthquakes are really, logistically speaking, earthquakes are incredibly challenging. And then you might sort of get a team of guys to drive out to you from the capital with all the supplies you need. They get robbed en route.
Mm.
They turn up with nothing. So yeah, they're very challenging. Very
Uh,
challenging.
Questions from David now. So, how did your time as a soldier shape your work as a news editor today?
I, yeah, that's also a really good question. I think um, sort of being able to deal with large amounts of information, knowing that information is incomplete, and being able to make judgments based on that information is something I do all the time. If you're sort of logistically and editorially kind of making judgments on what you do know, whilst being aware that what you do know is incomplete, is something that you do at a level in the army. I mean, frankly, in the British Army, you're doing that from Lance Corporal up, really, aren't you? In some way or another, any command responsibility, you're doing that. It
Yeah.
may get more complex. It might be sort of, as you get to like half colonel or whatever, an awful lot more factors in play, but the principle's the same, right? And so that's something. Being able to analyze and judge, and just sometimes just make a decision, knowing that might be wrong, but that's you're deciding with what you got. That's valuable in journalism. That's valuable, or it's certainly valuable as a news editor. Probably valuable in all walks of life, I would say.
Mhm.
Maybe confidence, having the confidence to communicate with people, to come and talk to you, knowing that there's some tricky questions written on your laptop, but that sort of, you need to have a certain amount of confidence, I think, in journalism to get by. To talk to strangers. Essentially, that takes. I wouldn't have been able to do that prior to joining the army. I don't think
Mhm.
I would have been able to go and knock on someone's door and said, "Look, I'm investigating something that you're in some way key to, or important to, or have knowledge of, and you know, I would like you to invite me into your house and talk about something that might not even be to your advantage."
Yeah.
That takes that. So the army's great for building. Well, the services generally, I think, are great for building that kind of confidence, that sort of ability to sort of believe in yourself.
Yeah.
I had very little self belief as a, well, not very little. That's not true, but I was the forces really noticeably built my confidence and my belief in myself and my that
Exactly the same
sort
for
of
me. Yeah.
security in my own kind
Yeah.
of being comfortable in my own skin and accepting that I've got faults, but not letting them sort of define me. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Not letting them over the things that I'm not good at. Not
Yeah.
Don't worry about the things you're not good at. Concentrate on things you are good at. And the forces were brilliant for that.
Mm.
Brilliant for that.
Mhm.
You know.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of top of my head.
No, good. How has war reporting changed in the age of fake news and propaganda?
I did. There's that old. That's another great question. The Yeah, I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I mean, there's the old classic saying that the first casualty of war is truth. Propaganda in war has been they've been bedfellows since long before the information age. So in one sense, nothing's changed. Um, I mean, there's a lot more to. So, for instance, we rely in conflict zones. It's not always possible to be everywhere. We try where money permits and where the situation allows. We try and do our own eyewitness reporting because it's just the best way of saying what's going on is to go there, see it yourself, and report it. Doesn't mean that people will believe it anymore necessarily. One still gets, one will still get opinions or whatever. But if you can go somewhere, film it, show it, say this is what we saw, that's kind of gold standard war reporting, or gold standard journalism, I would say. Where that's not possible, Gaza, no journalists allowed in, haven't been since the start of this situation. So we're relying on the journalists who are there already. The journalists who are there already are doing amazing work, um, and they work for us. We have everyone has their own teams who work for them. Work before the situation, work for us. So they're incredible guys, incredibly courageous. They do an incredible job, but they're constantly subject to this kind of, yeah, but they're all Hamas, aren't they? Yeah, but they're all partial because they live there, and so on and so forth. Which is in certainly in our case absolutely 100% not true. But there's no substitute for going there yourself and with your own your own reporters that everybody knows and recognises. So in the circumstances like that, we use it. Gaza's actually better than a lot of places. We do have our own journalists there, and they've done amazing stuff and sent us some award-winning reports. But there are some places where we don't even have anyone. We don't have. We're literally relying on social media, for instance, particularly in the early stages of stuff, or in kind of places that are simply hard to get to. And then there's a whole, you know, well, we can sort of verify this to that point. Do we run that? Do we, and then it gets really difficult to make those judgments. So has propaganda changed? I don't think the principles changed at all. What has changed is that people will propagandize, people will know that we will use social media footage, for instance, and so that gets propagandized and that gets manipulated. And there's constantly sort of stuff that says it's this online and it's not. And there are ways to check that and there are
Yeah.
ways to verify that. But if you're in a hurry and if you're not doing due diligence and you whack this on and you say this is this and it's that, then that's reputationally damaging.
Yeah.
And I've made that mistake actually. I've used a piece of footage that it was the place and it was the story, but it was a different date than the date that said.
Yeah.
So it didn't actually have the effect of being misleading, but it was nonetheless not what we said it was, and that was my
Yeah.
fault. I think it's the only time I've only done it once, and it was obviously a good faith mistake, but it was a function of working quickly under pressure of time. checking, yes, but just not checking enough, frankly. And I sort of held my hands up, and not sure. That was it was one of those things that doesn't mislead, so it wasn't so much of a problem as it could have been. But yeah, it's something you have to be alert to. Good example is Syria, where the chemical weapons attacks and so on. This whole thing about crisis actors, and then all the footage was being questioned, and then there was footage that was fake, that wasn't related to that, and then the idea to just throw enough mud, throw enough smoke, throw enough doubt, and people will believe this hadn't happened. Oh, it did happen. It incontrovertibly did happen. And there's huge bodies of evidence, including a report, which, if you're interested, you should read, from the United Nations Chemical Weapons Inspectors. But there was a whole debate about it, a discussion about it, not just online, but also in the legacy media and newspapers. And so, and that whole debate was a function of deliberate kind of throwing of smoke and trying to obscure that, trying to deflect that, and trying to suggest that yes, it looks like this, but actually it's that. And yeah, it's difficult. It's very difficult, and it requires you have to just slow down a bit and not be in a rush. We're very competitive, right? Animals, we just are by nature of journalism, not necessarily unhealthy, but it leaves us vulnerable to trying to get something on too quickly, trying to get something on before I want to get my story on before Hugh gets his on. And if you're not careful, you can make mistakes. So I think that the difference, I think the propaganda, the fact of it hasn't changed at all. I think the ways in which it operates, manipulating video, manipulating clips online and so on, that's changed. It's changed technically. Is that a sensible answer?
Yeah. Thank you. Right, 2 questions left. My bladder is going to burst. So, have you ever had to choose between telling the full truth and protecting lives or relationships? So, tell the full truth at the expense of lives or relationships, or don't tell the full truth to protect those lives or relationships.
Don't know. Never been in that position. I'm quite glad to say
So,
I've
you
never.
3 people under the bus then.
No, I mean, it's
I'm
just.
joking.
I just
I'm joking.
the situation's never arisen. I don't
Okay,
think.
yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to think of a time when that's. I mean, I'm not fundamentally. I'm not an investigative journalist, so mostly I do news. So it's kind of the situation doesn't arise really.
Mhm.
Generally speaking, I think it's true to say that our sources, as we protect our sources, I think, and people will go to jail for it. People have gone to jail for it, and I think that's the problem. The problem is if you don't, the one time that if you don't, then no, why would anyone talk to you confidentially again?
Yeah.
If you're sort of if you have doubts about my willingness to protect your identity, if you're talking to me about something that requires that, B, my ability to is the other point. Is my OPSEC and my or ComSec, or whatever you call it, my ability to kind of make sure that your identity is disguised. If you have doubts about that, why would you talk to us? And there's lots of people who don't. There's lots of people who will not engage, want to get a story out, and they'll go through sort of third party things, and you'll get halves of stories and bits of stories.
Yeah.
I can't work with that.
Yeah.
I need to sit down with this person and make my own judgments and check their bona fides. And people are, I'm not going to do that because I don't trust you enough, or or the consequences are so big that I'm not going to take the risk, or whatever.
Yeah.
And so them stories don't happen. But yeah, but broadly speaking, we take it incredibly seriously. Sources throwing people under the bus in terms of people who work with us. I've never heard of that happening.
Have you ever, where is it? Have you ever faced pressure to censor or alter a story? And if so, how did you handle it?
Yeah, I mean, where there's constant pressure to alter stories, I'm not censor, not so much. No, I wouldn't necessarily use that word. But I mean, it sort of balance things. So here's an example, right? And there's not a right or wrong here, but reasonably early in the current conflict in Gaza, we might interview people in Gaza who might say this is a genocide. Is that acceptable? It's their words, their opinion. It's obviously their words and their opinion. It's obviously not yours. You're simply using that soundbite of them saying that. Is that acceptable?
Are you saying, is it acceptable to publish that?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Not everyone thinks that. So that was a live debate. It became more common to hear that word when the courts got involved, because it is a legal term, right? It's a specific legal term with specific legal meanings. So it became more, would we say that without a court having decided it? Never. But should people themselves express their opinion that this is a genocide, or should they be allowed to do that, or should we be censoring them? That was a live debate at one point in that conflict, and I think in the end, I think we took the view that as long as it's very clear that this is their view, but that was an issue, that was a debate. I'll give you another example. Um, would you using the word terrorist, is that even helpful at all in any context anywhere? Right? It's a live debate. It's an argument that's been going on for as long as terrorism. I remember having this argument with the the IRA, and when I was in Northern Ireland. Is it one person's terrorist, another person's freedom fighter? Those kind of discussions. That's a constant thing. Do we decide that Hamas is a terrorist organization? So break that down a bit. Were the attacks of October 7th, was it 7th, the attack that sparked war, was that an act of terrorism? I think incontrovertibly yes. I'm sure everyone would agree with that. I find it very hard to define it another way. Are all members of Hamas, like the Minister of Health or the Minister,
I don't
are they
think
all
I
terrorists?
don't.
And is that helpful to frame it in that way? That's
Not
a
sure.
more interesting discussion. I'm not going to come down on a side on that. But so in terms of, is there pressure to change to change your reports or to modify your reports constantly, all the time? These arguments, these discussions, these judgment calls are like kind of part of the job almost. They're constantly, and they evolve, and they change, and they're difficult, and there's no right or wrong kind of answer, and either way you'll get flack. You just have to pick what you think is the most reasonable way through, whether it's middle ground or whether it's we're going to attach to using this particular form of words in this particular circumstance. ISIS, then it was Daesh, and it was so-called ISIS, the whole kind of what you call them that doesn't glamorize them but does, because there was a push from government, you might remember, to call them Daesh because that was the Arab pejorative, but that never really took on because it just sounds weird. It doesn't sound like, it sounds like a kind of cartoon character or something, so it never really took on in the media much. But there was a whole discussion around that. What about so-called Islamic State? Is that better than Islamic State? Does one validate them? And there's always pressure to change. There's always pressure to not say this or say that or use this form of words. But it's healthy. It's not an unhealthy pressure. It's not like a censorship. It's not like you can't say this because. It's more about what's the best way to deal with this that doesn't attach value judgments to it, doesn't sort of attach ourselves to supporting one side or another, but is reasonable and is understandable by the public. It has to make sense. So those discussions are like, I wouldn't say every day, but they're common. Yeah. Am I avoiding the question there? Is that a reasonable answer?
No, it's fine. Yeah, it's absolutely fine.
So in terms of censorship, if anyone said, well, we don't want you to say this for whatever reason, that we don't, that's something to be true, you've proven to your normal, you've done your due diligence, you've proved it, you're going to run it. Does anyone then say, no, you can't run it? Is there a kind of big, what do they call it in the army? The long screwdriver? Is that when Westminster get involved and say you can't do that? So I've never come across that personally. Never happened. To my knowledge, I can't say obviously that never happens because I can only speak to my own experience, but in my own experience, no.
Right, it's been a real pleasure. I was, what I was hoping to get from today was behind the curtain conversation, first hand account of commentary and perception and experience of all of the things that annoy me about legacy media, and speak to someone who's in that. It's been really useful for me, really has, and I've definitely changed my opinion on things somewhat. Maybe not an extreme change, but I'm definitely a little bit less cold to legacy media than I was before that we started the mics rolling. Well done, you.
Excellent.
But more importantly, what you're doing on the TBI research, mate, is it's incredibly important, and it is a huge amount of effort, and in an ideal world, it would be front and center of every flipping newspaper and news outlet ever, all the time, every day, until the situation improves. But that's not the case, and so I would assume there are large parts of this at the moment which appear like a thankless task, but but it's super important work, and it will undoubtedly, literally, what you're doing will undoubtedly play a part in saving lives and improving lives. So thank you for what you're doing. I really mean it. I really mean it.
That's good of it. I think if Kate said, I think if one person, I feel this, if one person feels they're not alone,
Yeah.
then it's worth doing. It's worth all the work, and I think that's what we're for as a journalist, right? Isn't it?
Yeah.
That's kind of what we should be for anyway. So
yeah, exactly.
So yeah, no. It's,
So on that,
thank you.
you mentioned in the middle of, so if people have got experience or want to contribute to what you're doing in terms of the TBI research, or get in contact with you about it, it's investigations at itn.com.co.uk.
n.co.uk.
Investigations at itn.co.uk, or Paul.Tyson.
Or just find me on social.
All right, cool. Yeah, perfect. Anything else we need to plug?
No, all good.
I do want you to come back. We have not touched on any of your career. I want to hear the career from start to finish. I want to know all the wars you've been in. I want all the stories. I want to go from start to finish. We'll cover your military career, but we'll quickly get on to journalism career, if you're up for that.
Yeah, no, 100%. No, hopefully
I reckon the questions will be easy for you as well.
Questions have all been really legitimate. Absolutely. Some of them have been fantastic, actually. All questions should make you go like that before you answer them, I think. So, no, it's been great. I've enjoyed it. It's been lovely to meet you again. And hopefully I'll come back when we made a bit more progress on TBI, and I can feel like I'm not at the start of something, feel like I'm halfway up a mountain rather than just looking at it from base camp. But yeah, be a pleasure.
Good luck with everything. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you.
Bob.